In every neighborhood, there's someone who fades into the background. The man who keeps to himself, who never raises his voice, who smiles politely but rarely lingers. Jeffrey Dahmer was that man. He walked the same sidewalks, shopped at the same stores, even chatted with his neighbors about the weather. Yet behind his calm eyes was a labyrinth of urges and fantasies that no one could see. For years, he rehearsed his rituals in silence, building a private world where control, secrecy, and obsession replaced any trace of normal human connection. What makes a seemingly ordinary person cross the invisible line between thought and action? How can a quiet neighbor become the center of one of the most shocking criminal cases in modern history? This is the story of Jeffrey Dahmer, Milwaukee's quiet neighbor, and the chilling reality of a mind at war with itself, hiding in plain sight as we step into Jeffrey Dahmer's unsettling story together. I'd love for you to be part of the conversation. If you're finding this deep dive interesting, a simple tap on the like button lets me know and helps more curious minds discover it too. If you enjoy true crime stories told this way, feel free to subscribe so you'll always catch the next one. And after watching, share your thoughts about Jeffrey Dahmer and his story in the comments. I genuinely enjoy reading what you think, and it helps our little community grow. Chapter 1: A Troubled Beginning. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer begins in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, on May 21, 1960, a time when the city seemed ordinary, calm, and unaware of the darkness that would later emerge from one of its quietest neighborhoods. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer, a couple whose marriage was marked by tension, miscommunication, and a lack of emotional stability. His father, a chemist with a strong interest in psychology, often found himself absorbed in work, analyzing patterns and human behavior from a clinical standpoint, yet struggling to truly connect with his own son. Joyce, on the other hand, was reported to be distant and preoccupied with her own struggles, occasionally prone to emotional volatility that would create a sense of unease in the household. These early familial dynamics formed a backdrop of instability, a subtle undercurrent that would influence Dahmer's perception of relationships and boundaries. From a very young age, Jeffrey displayed signs that something within him was different from his peers. He was often withdrawn, preferring to spend hours alone with his thoughts, fascinated by animals, particularly in observing their deaths. As a child, he began collecting roadkill and dissecting it, a habit that, while disturbing to those who eventually noticed it, remained hidden beneath the surface for years. This morbid curiosity was not something he shared openly, but it reflected a nascent fascination with mortality and control, a theme that would echo through his later crimes. Friends and acquaintances later described him as quiet and unassuming, a boy who never seemed to invite much attention, slipping through social spaces almost invisibly, yet harboring an intense internal world that no one could quite access. School years did little to reveal the complexities of Jeffrey's mind to others. Academically, he was reasonably capable, though not exceptional, and socially, he often struggled. He was teased for being different, for his quiet demeanor, and for his lack of interest in the normal childhood pursuits of sports or play. It was during this period that he began to confront feelings of isolation and confusion about identity. Reports suggest he experienced early episodes of depression, combined with confusion regarding his sexual orientation. In an era where these subjects were rarely discussed openly, especially in the conservative environment of 1960s and 1970s Milwaukee, he internalized these conflicts, retreating further into his own world of obsessions and fantasies. Dahmer's home life further complicated his development. His parents' relationship was strained and volatile, culminating in a divorce when Jeffrey was a teenager. Such upheaval deepened his sense of instability, fostering a profound loneliness that seemed almost physical in its intensity. During this period, he began experimenting with alcohol as a coping mechanism, a choice that would later become central to his ability to manipulate victims and disarm those around him. The combination of familial tension, social isolation, and early substance use created an environment in which his darker impulses could quietly take root. Unnoticed by the world outside his home. It was around this time that the first whispers of abnormal behavior began to appear. While many children collect insects or small animals out of curiosity, Dahmer's focus on dissection, preservation, and control signaled a psychological trajectory far more disturbing. He was fascinated not just by the life of these creatures, but by their death, their transformation from living beings into objects under his control. This fascination, though seemingly benign to an outsider unaware of the depth of his obsession, foreshadowed the patterns he would later enact on human victims. The impulses were there early, shaped by an environment lacking emotional regulation and an absence of guiding intervention that might have redirected him toward safer channels of curiosity. Teachers, classmates, and neighbors remembered Dahmer as polite, unobtrusive, almost invisible. He would sit quietly, avoid confrontation, and respond minimally to the attention of adults. Yet, there were fleeting moments when his darker curiosity emerged, subtle and often dismissed as eccentricity. Some childhood friends noted that he would speak unusually about death, animals, and science in ways that made adults uneasy but not alarmed enough to intervene. This is the paradox of Dahmer's early life. He existed in plain sight, yet no one could truly see the complexities and shadows shaping him from within. Even as a child, Dahmer demonstrated a certain meticulousness. He observed patterns, cataloged thoughts, and began to develop a sense of control over aspects of his life that others might have found chaotic. While most children at his age sought connection and validation, Jeffrey's mind was increasingly preoccupied with understanding, dissecting, and controlling life and death in small, private ways. This foundation, laid in the quiet years of his childhood, would later expand into behaviors far more extreme, as the impulses that began in curiosity and isolation evolved into acts of manipulation and violence. By the time Jeffrey reached adolescence, the combination of social isolation, familial instability, and early obsession with death had created a young man who was extremely private, deeply conflicted, and increasingly detached from the norms around him. The world outside seemed distant, unrelatable, and at times threatening, while the inner world of control, fantasy, and observation offered comfort and fascination. For a child growing up in the 1960s Midwest, these traits might have remained unnoticed by society at large, hidden behind polite smiles and a quiet demeanor. Yet they were the first threads in a complex tapestry that would later reveal one of the darkest patterns in modern American crime history. Even in retrospect, psychologists and criminologists analyzing Dahmer's early years note that his development illustrates a combination of environmental influence and innate tendencies. Childhood curiosity that turned to obsession, isolation that turned to detachment, and internal conflict that turned to manipulation of reality were all present long before the world would see the devastating manifestation of these traits. Milwaukee's quiet neighbor had already begun forming, quietly unnoticed, in the unremarkable streets of a seemingly ordinary city. The early years of Jeffrey Dahmer's life, marked by silence, fascination with death, and the struggle to connect, set the stage for what was to come. In understanding these formative experiences, one begins to see the subtle ways in which environment, personality, and circumstance can converge, creating conditions where darkness, once latent, finds a path to surface. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer is not merely a tale of violence. It is a chilling case study in how early shadows, unaddressed and misunderstood, can grow into something far more terrifying. As Jeffrey Dahmer moved further into adolescence, the threads of his childhood obsessions and isolation began weaving a more complex and troubling pattern. By his early teens, the combination of a fractured family life, social rejection, and a deepening fascination with death had created a psychological environment that was ripe for the emergence of darker impulses. Dahmer's interests, which had once been merely peculiar, began taking on a more secretive and private intensity. Where once he had dissected small animals, he now found himself pondering the nature of human mortality and the idea of ultimate control. It is critical to understand that these thoughts were not expressed openly. They existed largely within the confines of his mind, shielded by politeness and a veneer of normalcy that would later make him so deceptively quiet to those around him. At home, the tension between his parents persisted, even after their divorce. Dahmer's father remained a figure of intellectual influence but was emotionally distant, often analyzing his son's behavior from a clinical standpoint rather than engaging with him as a nurturing parent might. His mother's emotional instability, characterized by erratic moods and periods of depression, further compounded Jeffrey's sense of disconnection. In this environment, the young Dahmer learned to retreat, finding solace in his private observations and increasingly elaborate fantasies. Psychologists who later studied his life noted that this combination of neglect, inconsistent parenting, and exposure to adult conflict contributed to his early detachment from typical emotional bonds and empathy. By the age of 14, Dahmer had begun to exhibit patterns that would alarm psychologists today. He drank heavily, an unusual behavior for someone so young, using alcohol as a mechanism to dull internal conflict and ease social interactions he found challenging. Simultaneously, his fascination with death intensified. He began imagining scenarios in which he could exert absolute control over life and death, contemplating how he might preserve or manipulate bodies. While outwardly he continued to attend school, maintain a semblance of routine, and interact minimally with peers, the internal world he constructed was dark, highly structured, and increasingly detached from the moral boundaries that govern ordinary social life. Socially, Dahmer's adolescence was marked by an acute awareness of difference and alienation. He struggled to forge meaningful connections, often feeling that he could not relate to classmates or find acceptance among friends. This alienation was compounded by his sexual confusion. He recognized attractions to men, a realization that, in the cultural context of the 1970s, brought both internal anxiety and further isolation. These feelings were never openly discussed and were often suppressed, intensifying Dahmer's retreat into fantasy and control. For a young mind, the combination of isolation, internalized shame, and obsessive tendencies created a dangerous feedback loop. Each feeling of disconnection reinforced the drive toward private exploration of impulses without oversight or moderation. During these years, Dahmer's behaviors often went unnoticed or were dismissed as eccentricity. Teachers and neighbors may have noted his quiet demeanor, his odd fascination with certain subjects, or his occasional morbid comments, but none perceived the trajectory that was forming beneath the surface. He appeared as an ordinary, if introverted, teenager, someone who could sit in a classroom unnoticed, perform adequately on assignments, and keep to himself. This ability to blend in, to appear harmless and even polite, would become a defining feature of his life as an adult, allowing him to evade suspicion for years while committing crimes that were unimaginable to those around him. It was in this period that the early impulses toward human violence began to crystallize, initially in fantasy rather than action. Dahmer would imagine scenarios in which he could assert total dominance over another person, controlling their movements, their reactions, and ultimately their life. These thoughts, while still internal and unacted upon, signaled the emergence of what psychologists call a paraphilic fantasy life, an elaborate mental rehearsal of acts that, if unimpeded, might later manifest in reality. The importance of this stage cannot be overstated. Fantasy alone, when combined with isolation and early exposure to alcohol as a coping mechanism, created a foundation upon which real-world criminal behavior could later build. Alongside these fantasies, Dahmer continued his fascination with corpses and dissection, a hobby he had maintained from childhood but which now gained sophistication and secrecy. He experimented with preserving small animals, studying anatomy with meticulous attention to detail. These actions, while seemingly academic or scientific in nature, reflected an internalization of control and objectification that foreshadowed his later actions with human victims. The step from animal to human, though morally and legally unthinkable, was a progression that grew quietly in his mind, nurtured by solitude, curiosity, and the absence of corrective intervention. Family life, adolescence, and early adult experiences converged to create a young man whose quiet exterior masked a deeply complex internal world. Dahmer's ability to observe, adapt, and conceal allowed him to navigate social environments without detection, a skill that would later make him so frighteningly effective at evading suspicion. His early years were thus not defined solely by dysfunction, but by the subtle, almost invisible way in which obsession, isolation, and environmental neglect combined to form the psychological blueprint of a future killer. Understanding these formative years is crucial not to sensationalize, but to examine the intersection of nature and nurture, the subtle interplay between internal impulses and external circumstances. Dahmer's early life reminds us that even in ordinary settings, beneath quiet streets and seemingly normal homes, there can exist patterns of thought and behavior that, if left unrecognized and unaddressed, may escalate into something extraordinary and tragic. Milwaukee's quiet neighbor was already taking shape, a boy whose childhood curiosities and coping mechanisms would eventually evolve into the chilling reality that would later shock the nation. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer's early life is one of contrasts, normalcy and abnormality, curiosity and obsession, politeness and internal darkness. It serves as both a psychological case study and a cautionary tale, revealing how isolation, early exposure to family conflict, and untreated psychological disturbance can intertwine, quietly building a foundation for later horrors. These early shadows, unremarkable to most observers at the time, contained the seeds of a dark, complex life, marking the first chapter in the story of one of America's most infamous killers. Chapter 2: Adolescence and Early Signs. Isolation and obsession. As Jeffrey Dahmer transitioned from childhood into adolescence, the quiet patterns of his early years began to crystallize into behaviors and thoughts that were both more defined and more concerning. While many teenagers wrestle with identity, social pressures, and curiosity about the adult world, Dahmer's struggles were compounded by profound isolation, a deepening fascination with death, and an emerging sense of control over life that would later manifest in terrifying ways. These formative teenage years provide crucial insight into how a seemingly ordinary boy began evolving into one of America's most notorious killers, and understanding them requires a close examination of both environment and psychology. During his early teenage years, Dahmer's family life continued to be strained. His parents' divorce had left lasting emotional scars, and the instability of his home environment contributed to a growing sense of disconnection from the world around him. While his father remained intellectually engaged, offering guidance and insight from a clinical perspective, there was little emotional support or warmth. His mother's struggles with mental health, combined with frequent mood swings, created an atmosphere in which Dahmer learned that attachment could be unpredictable and unsafe. It was within this context of familial tension that he increasingly turned inward, finding comfort not in people, but in the routines of observation and analysis that had fascinated him since childhood. School offered little refuge for Dahmer. Though he was capable academically, he struggled socially, often feeling invisible and disconnected from his peers. Instances of bullying and teasing, although perhaps minor in the context of adolescent life, reinforced his sense of alienation. For a boy whose inner life was increasingly preoccupied with death and control, social rejection was not just painful. It became a catalyst for retreat. He learned to hide his inner world, presenting a veneer of politeness and normalcy while maintaining a private sphere in which his obsessions could develop without interference. This dual existence, outward conformity and inward fixation, would become a defining characteristic of Dahmer's life, allowing him to operate under the radar even as his impulses grew more dangerous. One of the most notable developments during Dahmer's adolescence was his early experimentation with alcohol. While casual underage drinking was not uncommon among teenagers, Dahmer's use of alcohol quickly became a tool for emotional regulation and social facilitation. It allowed him to numb feelings of shame, loneliness, and confusion, and later in life, it would serve as a critical component in his ability to manipulate and subdue his victims. Psychologists examining his development have noted that early substance use, combined with social isolation and obsessive tendencies, created a potent mix that weakened inhibitory controls, allowing fantasies to transition more readily into action as he matured. Dahmer's fascination with death, which had begun in childhood, intensified during these years. While many adolescents engage with dark themes in literature, movies, or art, Dahmer's focus was unusually literal and methodical. He collected and dissected dead animals, studying their anatomy with precision and curiosity. These activities were not casual hobbies. They reflected an early desire to understand the mechanics of mortality and control, to hold power over life and death in a way that felt safe and contained within his private world. The escalation of these behaviors during adolescence suggests a deepening compulsion, one that was quietly building toward future acts that would horrify the public. Sexual identity and attraction also played a significant role in shaping Dahmer's adolescent psychology. He recognized his attraction to men during a period when such feelings were heavily stigmatized and rarely discussed openly. The combination of internalized shame, societal pressure, and personal confusion added to his sense of isolation, pushing him further into secrecy and fantasy. Early diaries and recollections indicate that Dahmer began imagining scenarios in which he could exert total control over another person, blending sexual curiosity with the underlying theme of dominance and permanence that had begun in his childhood fascinations with death. These fantasies, though internal at this stage, were a critical step in the psychological trajectory that would eventually manifest in real-world crimes. During high school, Dahmer's behaviors were often dismissed by teachers and peers as quirks rather than red flags. His quiet, polite demeanor masked a complex internal life that no one could access. While he interacted minimally with classmates, he learned to read social cues and present a harmless exterior, skills that would later make him dangerously effective at deceiving adults and neighbors. He was able to maintain a facade of normalcy while simultaneously nurturing obsessions and compulsions that were becoming increasingly structured and ritualized. Even in the midst of these internal developments, Dahmer demonstrated a remarkable capacity for planning and observation. He meticulously cataloged thoughts and behaviors, noting patterns that fascinated him and imagining scenarios in which he could exercise control over others. These exercises were still largely theoretical at this stage, but they represent an early form of the premeditation and methodical thinking that would later define his criminal activity. The interplay between fantasy and planning during adolescence created a psychological framework that made the transition to violent action possible when the right circumstances arose. The social isolation, obsession with death, and early experimentation with alcohol and fantasy did not occur in a vacuum. Milwaukee in the 1970s and 1980s was a city like many others, filled with neighborhoods that seemed ordinary, routines that appeared safe, and people who were largely unaware of the quiet darkness evolving among them. Dahmer's ability to blend into this environment was enhanced by his unassuming appearance and polite demeanor, traits that would later allow him to lure victims without raising immediate suspicion. His adolescence, therefore, was not just a private internal development. It was the period in which he learned to operate effectively within society, masking deviance behind conformity. By the end of his teenage years, Dahmer had constructed an intricate internal world, one defined by secrecy, fantasy, and meticulous observation. Isolation, rejection, and early exposure to family conflict had shaped him into a young man whose outward behavior concealed a highly organized internal life preoccupied with control, death, and sexual curiosity. These early signs, while subtle and largely invisible to the outside world, were harbingers of the dark path that lay ahead. They illustrate how adolescence, a period of profound psychological growth, can sometimes amplify latent tendencies, particularly when combined with neglect, social alienation, and obsessive preoccupations. Understanding Jeffrey Dahmer's adolescence provides not only a window into his mind but also a broader perspective on how seemingly small disturbances in family dynamics, social integration, and early psychological development can converge to create conditions for extreme behaviors. Milwaukee's quiet neighbor was no longer just a withdrawn child. He was a teenager whose inner life was increasingly dominated by obsession, secrecy, and the meticulous planning of fantasies that would later evolve into real-world horror. As Jeffrey Dahmer moved further into his late teenage years, the psychological patterns established in early adolescence began to solidify into behaviors that were both more calculated and more concerning. The combination of isolation, obsessive fascination with death, and internalized sexual confusion created a private world that was increasingly detached from societal norms. This period of life, when most teenagers are exploring friendships, romance, and identity, saw Dahmer retreat further into secrecy, obsession, and meticulous control. A retreat that would lay the groundwork for the crimes that would later horrify Milwaukee and the nation. During these years, Dahmer's use of alcohol intensified. Initially a coping mechanism for social discomfort and anxiety, drinking became a tool to manage impulses and reduce inhibition. Unlike casual teenage drinking, however, Dahmer's consumption often coincided with his developing fantasies of control and manipulation. Alcohol allowed him to dissociate from feelings of guilt or moral conflict that might otherwise inhibit obsessive thoughts. This pattern is particularly significant because it illustrates how early substance use can interact with emerging psychological disorders to create a dangerous synergy, lowering barriers between fantasy and action. Simultaneously, Dahmer's interest in death and dissection evolved into increasingly sophisticated forms of observation. What began as collecting and dissecting roadkill now included a detailed study of anatomy and decomposition. He carefully documented his observations, preserving specimens and examining the mechanisms of decay with clinical precision. Psychologists analyzing these behaviors suggest that this meticulous attention to detail was not merely scientific curiosity but an early expression of the desire for control, a desire that would later manifest in his criminal acts. In many ways, these activities acted as rehearsal for later behaviors, allowing Dahmer to experiment with techniques, methods, and control in a private and consequence-free environment. Sexual identity remained a source of both fascination and anxiety. Dahmer was acutely aware of his attraction to men, yet he internalized shame and confusion because of the societal stigma surrounding homosexuality in the 1970s. These feelings were compounded by social isolation, making it difficult for him to find safe avenues for expression or exploration. Instead, These impulses merged with his fascination with control and death, forming a psychological nexus that intertwined sexual desire with fantasies of dominance and permanence. The internalized shame and secrecy intensified his need for private experimentation and control, further distancing him from normal social interactions and emotional development. Despite these internal struggles, Dahmer maintained an outwardly inconspicuous appearance. He remained polite, quiet, and seemingly ordinary, capable of blending into classrooms, neighborhoods, and social settings without raising suspicion. This duality, external normalcy versus internal darkness, would become a defining feature of his adult life. His ability to present a facade of harmlessness allowed him to navigate the world undetected, a skill that would later make it possible for him to lure victims without immediate suspicion. By late adolescence, Dahmer had honed this skill consciously or unconsciously. Through years of practice in social observation and concealment. It was during this period that early signs of ritualistic thinking began to emerge. Dahmer became increasingly preoccupied with the idea of permanence, how to preserve control over life, how to prevent separation or loss. This preoccupation was evident in his fascination with preservation techniques, both in his animal dissections and later in experiments with chemical solutions. Psychologists have noted that the development of such ritualized thinking during adolescence is significant because it reflects a deeper cognitive rigidity, a pattern of thought that prioritizes control over natural processes. In Dahmer's case, this rigidity would later manifest in horrifyingly methodical approaches to his victims. By the time he was approaching adulthood, Dahmer's internal world had become highly organized and private. He had learned to compartmentalize emotions, to suppress feelings of guilt and shame, and to channel obsession into controlled, private experimentation. While outwardly he might appear as a shy, polite, and ordinary young man, his internal life was dominated by compulsions, fantasies, and meticulous planning. This dual existence, which had its roots in childhood neglect, social isolation, and early fascination with mortality, was crucial in shaping the capacity for the calculated behavior that would define his crimes. During these years, interactions with peers remained limited and superficial. Dahmer rarely formed close friendships, and romantic relationships were largely absent. The lack of meaningful social bonds further reinforced his reliance on fantasy and internal control as sources of comfort. He developed a psychological self-sufficiency that, while adaptive in some respects, also meant that he lacked the social and emotional feedback that could have moderated his impulses. Isolation, in this sense, was both a symptom and a facilitator of his emerging pathology. It is also important to recognize that during adolescence, many individuals explore boundaries and experiment with identity in ways that are relatively benign. Dahmer's development, however, demonstrates how isolation, obsessive tendencies, and early environmental neglect can transform this period of exploration into a prelude for deviant and dangerous behavior. The trajectory from curiosity about death and anatomy to fantasies of domination over living beings illustrates a subtle but profound psychological evolution, a progression from thought to internal rehearsal, laying the groundwork for real-world actions that would later escalate into the criminal acts for which he became infamous. By the conclusion of his teenage years, Dahmer had constructed a complex psychological framework that combined secrecy, meticulous observation, obsession with control, and internalized shame. These traits, which had quietly matured beneath the surface of everyday life, would become the foundation of his later crimes. The adolescent years reveal the first clear signs of how early experiences, isolation, and obsession can converge to create a mind capable of extreme acts of violence, even in the absence of immediate environmental triggers or societal detection. Understanding Dahmer's adolescence is essential not only for comprehending his personal trajectory, but also for examining broader questions about the interplay of environment, biology, and psychology in the development of criminal behavior. The quiet, isolated teenager of Milwaukee, with his private obsessions and hidden compulsions, was unknowingly preparing for a future in which his ability to blend into society and manipulate circumstances would allow him to commit acts of unimaginable horror. These years provide a chilling reminder of how latent tendencies, nurtured in secrecy and isolation, can evolve into devastating reality. Chapter 3: The First Murders. Crossing the line. The trajectory from fantasy to action represents a pivotal shift in the life of Jeffrey Dahmer, a shift that would mark the first crossing of boundaries that no society could condone. By the late 1970s, Dahmer had moved beyond private obsession and into a stage where the internalized compulsions and meticulous planning of his adolescence began manifesting in real-world acts. These early murders, while initially small and experimental, set the stage for a pattern that would later escalate into a series of horrific crimes that shocked Milwaukee and the entire nation. Understanding this transition is essential not to sensationalize, but to comprehend the psychological, environmental, and circumstantial factors that allowed latent impulses to transform into action. Dahmer's first murder occurred shortly after high school, during a period of relative isolation. He had graduated but remained largely disconnected from peers, social activities, or meaningful employment. Reports indicate that he briefly enlisted in the Army, a move that may have reflected a desire for structure, escape, or experimentation with adult identity, but the experience was short-lived. Within months, he was discharged, reportedly due to issues related to alcohol use. Freed from institutional oversight, Dahmer returned to Milwaukee with few obligations and a mind already deeply conditioned to secrecy, obsession, and fantasy. It was in this environment, unmonitored and unchallenged, that the first crossing of the line occurred. The first known victim was a young man whom Dahmer encountered by chance, someone he perceived as vulnerable and manageable. The act itself was reportedly unplanned in its specifics, yet executed with a methodical precision that belied the impulsivity often associated with first-time offenders. This initial murder was not only an attempt to act on fantasy but also a test of boundaries, a way for Dahmer to explore the intersection of control, death, and secrecy in a real-world context. The psychological impact of the act on Dahmer was profound. Reports and later confessions indicate that the experience of killing, combined with the realization that he could act undetected, reinforced patterns of control and secrecy that had been cultivated during adolescence. In the wake of the first murder, Dahmer began to refine his methods. Unlike many impulsive killers, his approach was deliberate and calculated. He studied his victims, considered the logistics of luring them, and experimented with ways to maintain control during and after the act. This early experimentation was foundational for the more sophisticated techniques he would later employ, including the use of alcohol or sedatives to disarm victims and the development of rituals designed to preserve control over their bodies. The first murder, then, was not an isolated aberration. It was the opening act in a complex evolution of criminal methodology that combined psychological obsession with practical preparation. Dahmer's choice of victims in these early stages also reflected a pattern that would persist throughout his criminal career. He sought out individuals who were socially marginalized, less likely to be missed immediately, or otherwise vulnerable. This pattern reveals an acute awareness of risk, a calculating mind that understood both the practical and psychological aspects of predation. It also underscores the interplay between his personal obsessions and the external environment. Dahmer's fantasies were translated into action in ways that were facilitated by the social invisibility of his victims. During this period, Dahmer's personal life remained outwardly unremarkable. Neighbors and acquaintances continued to describe him as polite, quiet, and even unassuming. This dual existence, a dangerous inner life hidden beneath a facade of normalcy, became a hallmark of his early criminal behavior. It allowed him to navigate ordinary social spaces without raising suspicion, even as he enacted behaviors that would horrify anyone who became aware of them. The contrast between external ordinariness and internal deviance is a key feature of Dahmer's psychology, demonstrating how he could compartmentalize his actions, maintain appearances, and operate undetected for extended periods. Psychologically, the first murders reinforced the internal mechanisms Dahmer had been developing since childhood. The act of killing provided a perverse sense of control and mastery over life and death that he had long imagined but never enacted. It confirmed the efficacy of secrecy, the value of meticulous planning, and the psychological reward of realizing fantasies without consequence. This reinforcement created a feedback loop. Each act validated previous impulses, encouraged refinement of methods, and strengthened the internal belief that he could continue without detection. In essence, the first murders served as both an emotional and operational foundation for the crimes that would follow, embedding patterns that became increasingly sophisticated over time. Dahmer's early murders also highlight the role of opportunity and environment in the evolution of criminal behavior. Milwaukee, with its mix of bustling neighborhoods, transient populations, and areas of social invisibility, provided a setting in which Dahmer could operate with limited risk of immediate detection. The early victims were often individuals who were socially marginalized or alone, which not only made them more accessible, but also reduced the likelihood of rapid investigation. The intersection of Dahmer's internal compulsions with a permissive environment illustrates a recurring theme in criminology. Latent tendencies may remain dormant until circumstances provide a pathway for action. During this time, Dahmer continued to experiment with methods of control and disposal. While the first murder had been a combination of impulse and method, subsequent actions showed increasing premeditation. He began considering chemicals, confinement, and other techniques that would allow him to exert greater control over his victims while minimizing risk. The progression from fantasy to action to refinement of method demonstrates a chillingly systematic evolution, one rooted not in random violence but in calculated experimentation guided by internal obsession and external opportunity. By examining Dahmer's transition from adolescence into his first acts of murder, a clearer picture emerges of how a quiet, isolated individual could cross the line from thought to action. The first murders were both a psychological milestone and an operational template, illustrating the convergence of internal compulsion, environmental opportunity, and emerging methodological sophistication. These acts were the beginning of a pattern that would define Dahmer's criminal career, revealing the complex interplay between secrecy, control, and opportunity that allowed him to become the figure later known as Milwaukee's quiet neighbor. Following his initial act of murder, Jeffrey Dahmer entered a period of psychological reinforcement and methodical experimentation. The success of the first killing, defined not by morality but by the ability to act on his compulsions without immediate consequence, cemented patterns that would guide his subsequent actions. The first murder was not merely an isolated crime. It was the pivotal moment in which fantasy transitioned into reality, and this transition provided the foundation for the systematic approach he would refine over the next decade. In the wake of this first act, Dahmer became acutely aware of the mechanics of luring victims, maintaining control, and disposing of evidence. He experimented with alcohol, drugs, and various methods of isolation to ensure compliance from those he targeted. Unlike impulsive killers whose actions are chaotic, Dahmer demonstrated a remarkable degree of planning even at this early stage. He selected victims not only based on vulnerability but also on accessibility and opportunity, demonstrating an understanding of social invisibility and the dynamics of predation. This strategic mindset reveals a level of foresight and calculation that would become central to his methodology. One of the defining aspects of these early murders was Dahmer's growing focus on preservation. The fascination with maintaining control over life and death, first evident in childhood dissections of animals, began to manifest in human victims. He experimented with techniques for prolonging their existence, preserving bodies, and studying anatomy post-mortem. These actions were not purely scientific. They reflected a profound psychological need to exert mastery over mortality and permanence. Dahmer's early experimentation with preservation can be understood as a direct extension of adolescent obsessions, transformed into real-world acts that reinforced his sense of control and invincibility. The social environment of Milwaukee further facilitated his actions. Dahmer operated in a city that, while populated and urban, contained pockets of anonymity and transient populations. Many of his early victims were individuals whose absence might not be immediately noticed, which allowed him a margin of operational security. This confluence of internal obsession and external opportunity illustrates a key principle in criminology. Deviant behavior often escalates when internal predispositions meet permissive environmental conditions. Dahmer's ability to exploit these conditions marked the beginning of a trajectory in which repeated acts of violence were reinforced by both psychological satisfaction and practical feasibility. During this period, Dahmer's external life remained deceptively ordinary. Neighbors, colleagues, and acquaintances continued to describe him as polite, unassuming, and quiet, a normal young man who blended seamlessly into social spaces. This capacity for social camouflage became one of his most dangerous traits. It allowed him to move unnoticed, build trust with potential victims, and maintain a public facade that minimized suspicion. The contrast between his outward persona and his internal compulsions highlights a fundamental aspect of his criminal psychology: the capacity to compartmentalize actions and emotions, creating an effective mask that hid escalating deviance. Dahmer's early murders were also characterized by ritualized thinking and obsessive preparation. He meticulously planned each encounter, considering the logistics of isolation, control, and disposal. This attention to detail reflected both his desire for mastery and his understanding of risk. Each act was a rehearsal for subsequent crimes, providing practical lessons that he applied to refine his methods. In this way, the first murders were not only expressions of compulsion but also the initial stages of a highly systematic criminal career, where experimentation, observation, and repetition coalesced into methodical patterns of predation. Psychologically, these early acts reinforced a feedback loop that combined compulsion with gratification. The act of killing provided a profound sense of control and validation, confirming that his fantasies could be realized without immediate consequence. This reinforcement strengthened his internal belief system, normalizing deviance and reducing psychological barriers to further action. In effect, Dahmer's early murders served as both emotional validation and operational training, solidifying behaviors that would escalate in frequency, complexity, and brutality. It is important to note that Dahmer's actions during this stage were not widely detected. Unlike sensationalized portrayals of serial killers as immediately obvious threats, Dahmer's early crimes were facilitated by his ability to remain inconspicuous. His victims were often socially marginalized, transient, or isolated, which minimized the risk of immediate investigation. Combined with his polite and quiet exterior, this allowed him to operate in relative anonymity, a factor that encouraged repetition and escalation. The first murders thus illustrate the interaction between individual psychology and social environment, highlighting how hidden deviance can flourish when both internal compulsion and external conditions align. By the end of this formative period, Dahmer had developed a disturbing blend of traits: meticulous planning, ritualized obsession, practical experimentation, social camouflage, and an emerging sense of invincibility. Each early act of violence reinforced the psychological mechanisms that allowed him to compartmentalize guilt, perfect methods, and manipulate circumstances. These formative murders were the foundation upon which all subsequent crimes were built, representing a chilling transition from adolescent fantasy to calculated predation. Understanding these first acts of murder is critical for comprehending the broader trajectory of Dahmer's criminal life. They illustrate the convergence of personal compulsion, environmental opportunity, and methodological refinement. Milwaukee's quiet neighbor was no longer just an isolated adolescent with disturbing fantasies. He had crossed the line into real-world violence, establishing patterns that would define his future as one of America's most infamous serial killers. The first murders were both a psychological milestone and a procedural blueprint, marking the point where hidden obsession became active, deliberate, and tragically consequential. Chapter 4: College, Rejection, and the Path to Darkness. Following his first acts of violence, Jeffrey Dahmer entered a period of transition, one marked by attempts to integrate into adult society while simultaneously nurturing obsessions that had begun in childhood and adolescence. College presented both opportunity and challenge, a stage in life where independence, identity, and social connections intersected in complex ways. For Dahmer, this period became a crucible in which his inner compulsions intensified, social inadequacy was magnified, and the trajectory toward increasingly violent behavior became clearer. Dahmer enrolled briefly at Ohio State University in 1978, seeking what many young adults do: purpose, social identity, and a pathway to a career. Academically, he had sufficient aptitude to navigate coursework, though he displayed little passion or sustained focus. His attendance was irregular, and alcohol began to dominate his daily routine, providing both relief from anxiety and a buffer against the pressures of social engagement. While many college students experiment with alcohol, for Dahmer it became both a crutch and a tool, a way to reduce internal conflict, to ease social awkwardness, and to dull the moral inhibitions that might have restrained his darker fantasies. Socially, college proved alienating. Dahmer struggled to form meaningful connections, particularly with peers who could accept and understand him. Early experiences of rejection, combined with the social isolation of adolescence, amplified his retreat into private obsession. He found himself disconnected from typical social rituals, unable to forge intimate bonds, and increasingly preoccupied with fantasy. The contrast between the expectations of social integration in college and his own psychological detachment created a sense of internal tension, one that he attempted to manage through alcohol and secretive explorations of his emerging compulsions. It was during this period that Dahmer's internal fantasies began to grow more sophisticated. He imagined scenarios involving dominance, control, and the ultimate preservation of life and death, fantasies that combined sexual desire with meticulous planning. While these thoughts remained largely unacted upon at the time, they became increasingly vivid and compelling, forming a mental rehearsal for behaviors that he would later enact. Psychologists studying his development emphasize that the evolution of fantasy into detailed scenario planning is a critical stage in the trajectory of serial offenders, providing both gratification and a cognitive framework for real-world implementation. Dahmer's first experiences of rejection and failure outside the home, particularly in the college environment, had a profound psychological impact. Academic struggles, inability to form lasting friendships, and social marginalization reinforced a sense of invisibility and isolation. He began to perceive the world as a place in which ordinary rules of interaction did not apply to him, a perspective that further separated his internal life from the expectations of society. This internalization of isolation and detachment laid the groundwork for the increasingly methodical nature of his later crimes, emphasizing the interplay between social failure and the evolution of deviant behavior. Alcohol, which had already played a pivotal role in his adolescence, continued to serve as a facilitator of both coping and experimentation. Dahmer consumed heavily, often to the point of blackouts, which allowed him to detach from feelings of shame, guilt, and anxiety. In effect, alcohol became a psychological lubricant, reducing the friction between internal fantasy and potential action. The combination of internal preoccupation, substance use, and social disconnection created a fertile environment for escalating compulsions, establishing a pattern in which external social failure reinforced internal deviance rather than providing corrective feedback. During this period, Dahmer also began to explore opportunities for experimentation that involved real human interaction. While his early murders had been isolated incidents, the college environment exposed him to a broader array of potential victims, individuals whose social invisibility or personal vulnerability aligned with his emerging patterns of predation. Although he did not immediately act on these impulses, the environment reinforced the plausibility of real-world experimentation, demonstrating to Dahmer that fantasy could intersect with circumstance in ways that made action both possible and rewarding. Psychologically, Dahmer's time in college highlights the intersection of internal compulsion and environmental influence. Social rejection, academic disappointment, and isolation functioned not merely as stressors, but as catalysts that intensified existing obsessions and reinforced internal fantasy structures. The college years illustrate how external failure can intersect with latent tendencies to accelerate the development of methodical, compulsive thought patterns, particularly when combined with substance use and early exposure to deviant experimentation. It was also during this time that Dahmer began to grapple with his sexual identity more intensely. The cultural stigma surrounding homosexuality in the late 1970s created internal conflict, leading to a combination of shame, secrecy, and isolation. Unable to explore his attractions in socially acceptable ways, Dahmer redirected sexual desire into fantasy and internal rehearsal, often intertwining it with his fascination with death and control. This fusion of sexual and violent fantasy would become a defining feature of his criminal trajectory, forming the psychological template for later crimes in which desire, control, and obsession were inseparable. By the end of his brief college experience, Dahmer had entered a stage of psychological consolidation. Internal compulsions were intensifying, social isolation remained acute, and external opportunities for action were becoming increasingly apparent. The failure to establish meaningful social connections, coupled with the intensification of fantasy and experimentation, created a trajectory in which action on previously latent impulses became both conceivable and increasingly inevitable. College, then, represents a critical transitional phase, a period in which internal obsession met external possibility, and in which Dahmer began to recognize the mechanics by which fantasy could intersect with reality. Understanding Dahmer's college years is essential to comprehending how environmental failure, personal rejection, and internal obsession combine to facilitate the progression from fantasy to action. This period illustrates the importance of social integration, emotional support, and personal accountability in moderating deviant impulses. For Dahmer, the absence of these moderating influences allowed internal compulsions to gain strength, setting the stage for the increasingly methodical and violent behaviors that would follow. Milwaukee's quiet neighbor, once a withdrawn adolescent, was now a young adult whose inner world was dominated by obsession, isolation, and the dawning realization that his fantasies could potentially be enacted in reality. After leaving college, Jeffrey Dahmer returned to Milwaukee with a heightened sense of isolation and a growing preoccupation with fantasies that combined control, death, and sexual desire. The brief exposure to independence and the social challenges of college had reinforced his sense of detachment from the norms of society. while simultaneously sharpening his awareness of opportunity. Freed from structured oversight, Dahmer's internal world became increasingly dominant, dictating the trajectory of his thoughts and eventually his actions. During this period, Dahmer began seeking employment sporadically, taking on positions that offered minimal responsibility and limited social interaction. Jobs at grocery stores, factories, and other temporary positions provided income but little opportunity for meaningful social engagement. In effect, these workplaces functioned as a backdrop against which Dahmer could continue his internal experimentation and refinement of thought patterns without interference. His work habits reflected the duality that would characterize his life: externally compliant and inconspicuous, internally obsessive and detached from social norms. Alcohol remained a critical factor in his daily life. Dahmer consumed large quantities, often in isolation, using it to dull social anxiety, manage internal conflict, and reduce inhibition. This chronic use of alcohol not only reinforced patterns of isolation but also facilitated the psychological bridge between fantasy and potential action. Psychologists analyzing this stage of his life note that the combination of substance use and obsessive internal rehearsal creates a potent mechanism by which violent impulses can solidify, increasing the likelihood of transition from thought to real-world behavior. It was during these years that Dahmer began to experiment more deliberately with techniques to control others. He would approach men in bars, train stations, and other social settings, testing methods of luring them with alcohol or promises of money. These interactions were initially exploratory, allowing him to gauge reactions, assess vulnerability, and refine his methods. The fusion of sexual desire, curiosity about control, and predatory calculation became increasingly sophisticated, demonstrating both premeditation and a chilling understanding of human psychology. Dahmer's early experiments with social manipulation represent a critical stage in his development, bridging the gap between fantasy and actionable methodology. Dahmer's interactions with potential victims during this period were informed by his lifelong fascination with isolation and invisibility. He actively sought individuals who were socially marginalized, transient, or otherwise unlikely to draw attention if they disappeared. This selection process reveals a combination of practical calculation and internalized perception of vulnerability, illustrating how personal obsession and environmental opportunity can intersect to facilitate predatory behavior. Dahmer's early reconnaissance of potential victims foreshadowed the calculated precision of his later crimes. In parallel, Dahmer's internal fantasies grew increasingly elaborate. He imagined scenarios in which he could exert total control over another person, blending sexual gratification with the psychological reinforcement of dominance. These mental rehearsals were intensely detailed, involving methods of restraint, isolation, and even preservation, reflecting an advanced stage of premeditation rarely observed in first-time offenders. Psychologists have noted that the sophistication of these fantasies during the early adult years is a strong predictor of subsequent escalation, as it provides a cognitive blueprint for real-world enactment. By the early 1980s, Dahmer's internal life was dominated by a dual focus on secrecy and methodology. He had learned to compartmentalize, maintaining a facade of ordinariness in public while privately cultivating obsessions that merged sexuality, death, and control. The transition from adolescent experimentation to adult sophistication in method marked a dangerous evolution. Dahmer was no longer merely a socially isolated young man with disturbing interests. He had developed a strategic understanding of how to translate fantasy into action without immediate detection, a skill that would define his later criminal career. The role of rejection and social failure during this period cannot be overstated. Academic disappointment, fleeting employment, and continued social invisibility reinforced Dahmer's internal retreat. Without meaningful social bonds or corrective feedback, He increasingly relied on his private world for satisfaction and validation. This reliance allowed obsessive thoughts to dominate and for methods of control to develop unchecked. The intersection of personal failure and compulsive behavior created conditions in which external morality and social constraints held little sway over internal drives. Dahmer's early adult years also highlight the importance of opportunity in the development of predatory behavior. The urban environment of Milwaukee, combined with social marginalization of certain populations, provided the context in which Dahmer could explore his fantasies safely. The city's anonymity and the invisibility of vulnerable populations enabled experimentation with methods, testing of control, and ultimately, the transition from mental rehearsal to action. Each successful experiment reinforced his confidence and provided practical lessons that shaped subsequent acts. By the conclusion of this period, Jeffrey Dahmer had effectively entered a stage in which internal fantasy, external opportunity, and methodical experimentation intersected. He had learned to operate under the radar, select targets strategically, and combine sexual desire with predatory control. The early adult years marked a critical point in his evolution, transforming a socially isolated and obsessive young man into a calculating individual capable of initiating the criminal patterns that would later define his life. Milwaukee's quiet neighbor had now fully developed the psychological and methodological tools that would allow him to cross the line into repeated acts of murder with increasing sophistication and audacity. Chapter 5: Life in Milwaukee. A quiet neighbor. As Jeffrey Dahmer settled into adulthood in Milwaukee, he became the embodiment of the quiet neighbor image that would later confuse and horrify the city. On the surface, he appeared polite, unassuming, and socially unobtrusive. A man who maintained ordinary routines, interacted minimally with neighbors, and avoided drawing attention. Yet beneath this exterior, Dahmer's internal life was dominated by obsessive thoughts, compulsive desires, and a meticulously organized approach to predation. Understanding this duality, the external facade versus internal pathology, is crucial to comprehending how Dahmer was able to operate undetected for years, cultivating a disturbing pattern of violence while maintaining a superficial appearance of normalcy. Milwaukee in the early 1980s offered both anonymity and opportunity. The city had diverse neighborhoods, transient populations, and pockets of social invisibility where individuals could act without immediate detection. Dahmer exploited this environment with precision. He chose living spaces that were unobtrusive and rented to him without extensive scrutiny, allowing him to establish control over his surroundings. His apartments, while outwardly ordinary, became private laboratories for experimentation, reflecting his obsession with control, preservation, and meticulous organization. The quiet domestic spaces of his adult life were the stage on which he could safely merge fantasy and reality. Socially, Dahmer continued to struggle. While he interacted politely with neighbors and maintained minimal professional relationships, he rarely formed meaningful connections. This lack of social bonds reinforced his retreat into fantasy and ritualized behaviors. He observed the world around him, noting human interactions with curiosity, but largely as an outsider. This detachment was both protective and adaptive. It allowed him to avoid detection while simultaneously facilitating the development of increasingly complex methods for controlling and manipulating others. The contrast between his outward appearance and inner life was stark, highlighting a psychological duality that would characterize his criminal career. During this period, Dahmer refined his techniques for identifying and luring victims. Bars, bus stations, and other urban environments provided him access to men who were socially isolated or transient, individuals whose absence might not trigger immediate alarm. He developed methods to gain trust, offering companionship, alcohol, or promises of payment in exchange for cooperation. These methods were carefully calibrated to exploit vulnerability while minimizing risk. Dahmer's approach was neither random nor impulsive. It reflected a combination of obsessive planning, acute observation of human behavior, and internalized strategies for control. Within his private domain, Dahmer's obsessions with control, dominance, and preservation deepened. He experimented with chemical substances, physical restraints, and methods of prolonging control over his victims. These acts were not merely utilitarian. They were rituals, reflecting an intricate psychological framework in which mastery over life and death was both goal and reward. His fascination with anatomy, which had begun in childhood and evolved through adolescence, became increasingly sophisticated, merging scientific curiosity with deviant compulsion. The apartments that he occupied functioned as isolated laboratories where he could refine techniques and explore fantasies in a controlled, consequence-free environment. The psychological underpinnings of Dahmer's behavior during this time reveal a striking combination of compulsion and calculation. He was deeply driven by internal fantasies, yet he understood the importance of operational security. He compartmentalized guilt, maintained secrecy, and relied on social invisibility to continue his activities undetected. The duality between inner desire and outer normalcy created a formidable camouflage, allowing him to integrate into society superficially while engaging in behaviors that were extreme, methodical, and morally incomprehensible. Alcohol continued to serve multiple functions. It allowed Dahmer to manage social interactions, suppress moral inhibitions, and facilitate control over his victims. In combination with meticulous planning and observation, alcohol became both a psychological and practical tool, reinforcing his sense of mastery while reducing the emotional and cognitive barriers that might have otherwise inhibited action. Each successful interaction reinforced confidence, contributing to a feedback loop in which internal compulsions were strengthened by practical experience. Milwaukee's perception of Dahmer was shaped by his deliberate ordinariness. Neighbors and colleagues described him as quiet, polite, and largely invisible. A man who could live in close proximity for years without attracting attention. This perception underscores the danger inherent in appearances. Dahmer's ability to mask deviance behind mundane behavior allowed him to exploit trust and social norms. His quiet exterior was not accidental but a learned strategy, honed over years of observing human behavior and understanding the mechanics of concealment. Even as Dahmer's methods became more refined, he continued to maintain a semblance of daily routine. He shopped at local stores, interacted minimally with coworkers, and managed personal responsibilities with outward competence. These ordinary actions provided the perfect camouflage for the extraordinary and horrifying acts occurring in private. The quiet rhythms of daily life masked the escalating pathology, illustrating how extreme deviance can coexist with social normalcy when coupled with meticulous planning, social camouflage, and internalized secrecy. During this phase, Dahmer also began to develop patterns of experimentation and escalation. Initial acts of control and violence evolved into more deliberate and ritualized behaviors. He refined techniques for subduing and isolating victims, exploring methods to preserve control and prolong encounters. These experiments were iterative, informed by observation, reflection, and previous experiences. The apartments he occupied became testing grounds where method and compulsion merged, laying the groundwork for a pattern of escalation that would continue throughout his adult life. By the mid-1980s, Dahmer had become a master of concealment. Milwaukee's quiet neighbor was simultaneously an unremarkable adult and a meticulously calculating predator. The duality between external normalcy and internal pathology enabled him to operate with confidence, exploiting both social trust and systemic blind spots. Understanding this period is critical, as it illustrates how habitual concealment, obsessive planning, and environmental opportunity converge to allow extreme deviant behavior to persist undetected. Jeffrey Dahmer's life in Milwaukee during these years exemplifies a terrifying paradox. The most ordinary appearances can conceal extraordinary darkness. Through meticulous planning, social camouflage, and obsessive private experimentation, he transformed everyday spaces and routines into stages for predatory behavior. The quiet neighbor image not only allowed him to evade suspicion but also enabled a pattern of escalating violence that would eventually define his criminal career. Milwaukee, unaware of the danger lurking among them, witnessed the outwardly normal existence of a man whose inner life was increasingly dominated by obsession, secrecy, and methodical predation. As Jeffrey Dahmer's life in Milwaukee progressed, the contrast between his outwardly ordinary existence and his increasingly sinister private life became more pronounced. To neighbors and co-workers, he was a polite, quiet, and unassuming man, someone who appeared to live a simple, solitary life without drawing attention. Behind closed doors, however, Dahmer's internal world had become a laboratory of obsession, compulsion, and experimentation, meticulously constructed to merge fantasy with reality while maintaining the facade of normalcy. During this period, Dahmer refined his methods of selecting and approaching victims. Bars, bus stops, and other urban spaces provided him access to individuals who were socially isolated, transient, or otherwise unlikely to be reported missing promptly. His approach was careful and calculated. He would engage targets with a combination of charm, casual conversation, or offers of alcohol, creating a sense of trust and lowering resistance. This ability to read social cues and manipulate perceptions reflected not only his growing tactical awareness but also the cumulative psychological training that had begun in childhood and adolescence, reinforcing the dangerous interplay between observation and action. The apartments Dahmer occupied became extensions of his psychological and operational strategy. Within these private spaces, he conducted experiments on control, dominance, and preservation. He refined techniques to subdue and manipulate his victims, exploring chemical sedatives, restraints, and various methods of isolation. These actions, while rooted in obsession, were highly methodical, demonstrating that Dahmer's crimes were not impulsive or chaotic, but the product of careful planning and rehearsal. His home, outwardly mundane, was a hidden stage upon which his compulsion intersected with meticulous procedure. Dahmer's internal compulsions also grew increasingly intertwined with sexual gratification. Early fantasies of control and death had evolved into intricate mental scenarios in which sexual desire, dominance, and permanence were inseparable. These fantasies were not static. They were iterative, influenced by past experiences, experimentation, and reflection. The private enactment of these fantasies, though not yet fully realized in all cases, created a reinforcing loop, strengthening the compulsion to move from imagination to action. Each rehearsal in his mind and each experiment in his apartment served to sharpen both skill and desire. Alcohol remained central to Dahmer's methods, both socially and operationally. He used it as a tool to facilitate interactions with potential victims, reduce resistance, and lower his own internal inhibitions. It also played a psychological role, enabling him to suppress guilt, shame, or anxiety that might have otherwise interfered with his compulsions. The combination of substance use, meticulous planning, and careful observation exemplifies the complex interplay between internal psychological drivers and practical strategies, highlighting how multiple reinforcing factors can enable prolonged, undetected criminal activity. Despite his increasingly sophisticated private life, Dahmer continued to maintain an outward image of ordinariness. Neighbors observed routine behavior, doing laundry, shopping, quietly managing daily life. This mundane exterior was critical to his ability to operate undetected. The very ordinariness of his behavior shielded him, as people are rarely suspicious of someone who blends seamlessly into the social fabric. Dahmer's life in Milwaukee demonstrates a key principle in criminology. Extreme deviance can be concealed effectively through careful attention to appearance, routine, and social expectations. The progression of Dahmer's crimes during this period was also influenced by opportunity. The city provided both access to vulnerable populations and a degree of anonymity that minimized immediate risk of discovery. This environmental factor, combined with Dahmer's psychological preparation, enabled him to escalate experimentation and predation. Each interaction, whether successful or aborted, provided lessons that were integrated into his evolving methodology, enhancing efficiency, control, and secrecy. During these years, Dahmer also demonstrated increasing psychological compartmentalization. He was able to separate his outward persona from internal compulsions, maintaining social functionality while privately pursuing obsessions that grew more methodical and complex over time. This compartmentalization was not merely tactical. It reflected a deeply ingrained cognitive strategy, allowing him to navigate everyday life without arousing suspicion while pursuing activities that were profoundly deviant. The ability to maintain this duality is one of the reasons he remained undetected for so long, reinforcing the dangers of hidden pathology behind ordinary appearances. By the mid to late 1980s, Dahmer's pattern of predation was clear. His life in Milwaukee represented a dual existence. A man outwardly invisible, inwardly preoccupied with obsessive experimentation, planning, and the controlled execution of fantasies involving death and sexuality. Each act, each rehearsal, and each interaction contributed to the reinforcement and refinement of his methods. The city, meanwhile, remained unaware, witnessing only the facade of an ordinary neighbor who lived quietly, without drawing attention. Understanding Dahmer's life in Milwaukee during this period provides crucial insight into the intersection of personality, environment, and opportunity in the development of serial criminal behavior. It demonstrates how an individual can maintain social invisibility while methodically pursuing deviant goals, and underscores the importance of early psychological tendencies, social isolation, and environmental conditions in facilitating the transition from fantasy to repeated criminal action. Milwaukee's quiet neighbor was, in reality, a meticulously calculating individual whose internal world had become a laboratory of horror, laying the foundation for crimes that would shock the nation. Chapter 6: Escalation. Patterns and Obsession. By the late 1980s, Jeffrey Dahmer's private life had evolved into a complex network of obsession, ritual, and experimentation. The early murders and subsequent refinement of methods had created a psychological framework in which fantasy, control, and sexual desire were inseparable. During this period, Dahmer's behavior escalated both in frequency and sophistication, moving beyond initial opportunistic acts into a deliberate pattern that would define the core of his criminal trajectory. Understanding this escalation is crucial for grasping how compulsion, environment, and psychological reinforcement interact to create sustained deviant behavior. Dahmer's methodical approach to selection and luring of victims became increasingly precise. He targeted individuals who were socially isolated, young, and often transient, understanding that their disappearance would attract minimal immediate attention. Locations such as bars, bus stops, and clubs frequented by marginalized populations provided a steady pool of potential victims. Dahmer's selection was deliberate, guided by a combination of instinctual observation and strategic calculation. He would assess vulnerability, test willingness, and evaluate the potential risk of detection, demonstrating a growing sophistication in predatory behavior. Within his living space, Dahmer's rituals became more elaborate. He continued to experiment with chemical sedation, restraints, and physical manipulation, carefully observing reactions and refining techniques. His fascination with control, both over life and death, manifested in methods designed to prolong dominance over his victims. The apartments he occupied served as laboratories in which theoretical fantasies were translated into practical methods. Each experiment was iterative, informed by past experiences and an obsessive desire to perfect technique. This ritualization was not haphazard. It reflected a cognitive strategy in which control, repetition, and reinforcement were central. Psychologically, Dahmer's escalation can be understood as a feedback loop. Each successful act reinforced internal compulsions, providing both gratification and validation. This reinforcement encouraged repetition, deepened obsession, and enhanced methodological precision. In essence, the early thrill of acting on fantasy evolved into a structured system in which internal reward and practical experimentation coexisted. The interplay between fantasy and execution created a self-reinforcing mechanism, making deviation from this pattern increasingly unlikely. Alcohol continued to play a significant role in Dahmer's interactions. It served as both a tool and a psychological lubricant, facilitating engagement with potential victims while reducing his own inhibitions. The substance allowed him to test methods of control in real-world scenarios, bridging the gap between mental rehearsal and active execution. Alcohol was not merely recreational. It was instrumental in operational strategy, highlighting the intersection between psychological compulsion and practical facilitation. During this phase, Dahmer began to incorporate elements of preservation into his actions with greater intensity. Fascination with the permanence of control, manifested in fantasies of preservation, dissection, and anatomical study, was central to his obsessive patterns. He experimented with methods that could prolong the physical state of victims, testing techniques of chemical intervention, restraint, and manipulation. These actions were extensions of earlier adolescent fascinations, now executed with greater precision and a higher degree of understanding. The evolution from fantasy to ritualized procedure reflects a chilling progression in both psychological complexity and practical skill. Dahmer's ability to compartmentalize became even more pronounced. He maintained outward social normalcy while privately rehearsing increasingly elaborate and violent fantasies. Neighbors continued to describe him as polite, inconspicuous, and unremarkable, demonstrating his mastery of social camouflage. This duality, external ordinariness versus internal deviance, allowed Dahmer to exploit trust, blend into community routines, and avoid detection even as his patterns of predation escalated. The capacity for compartmentalization is one of the hallmarks of organized serial offenders, and in Dahmer's case, it was critical to sustaining repeated criminal activity over time. The escalating pattern of behavior also reflects the interaction between opportunity and internal compulsion. Milwaukee, with its urban anonymity, marginalized populations, and social blind spots, provided an environment in which repeated predation could occur without immediate interference. The city's structure, combined with Dahmer's psychological preparation and methodological refinement, created a scenario in which escalation was not only possible but likely. Each successful act provided data, reinforced compulsion, and offered lessons that informed subsequent actions, demonstrating the iterative nature of escalation in serial predation. Sexual desire and control remained intricately linked. Dahmer's fantasies were increasingly detailed, merging sexual gratification with the psychological reinforcement of absolute dominance. These thoughts were rehearsed extensively in his private life, evolving from theoretical exercises into precise procedural plans. The reinforcement from prior acts created a psychological expectation that fantasy could and would be realized, provided the proper methods were employed. This cognitive loop became central to the escalation of both frequency and intensity of his behavior. By this stage, Dahmer's criminal identity had begun to coalesce. The transition from early experimentation to sustained pattern reflected a convergence of multiple factors: internal compulsion, social invisibility, environmental opportunity, and methodical practice. Each act reinforced the psychological architecture underpinning his behavior, enabling him to operate with increasing confidence, sophistication, and secrecy. Understanding this phase of escalation provides insight into the mechanisms that sustain long-term deviant behavior and illustrates the interplay between opportunity, obsession, and operational method in the evolution of a serial offender. The late 1980s marked a turning point. Dahmer was no longer an experimental predator. He had become an organized, methodical, and increasingly confident individual whose private life was a laboratory for the systematic exploration of compulsion, control, and dominance. Milwaukee's quiet neighbor had transformed from a socially isolated young man into a calculating predator, poised for the sustained cycle of escalation that would define the next phase of his criminal career. As Jeffrey Dahmer continued his life in Milwaukee, the frequency, intensity, and sophistication of his predatory behavior escalated. The early experimentation with control and preservation had evolved into a systematic routine in which internal fantasy and real-world execution were inseparable. Each successful act reinforced his compulsion, normalized deviance, and provided lessons that refined method, increasing both efficiency and confidence. Understanding this escalation illuminates the mechanics by which latent obsession can mature into prolonged, methodical criminal behavior. Dahmer's selection of victims became increasingly strategic. He targeted men who were socially marginalized, young, and transient, minimizing the likelihood of immediate detection. His reconnaissance of potential victims was deliberate, often involving extended observation and assessment of vulnerability. He developed techniques to gain trust, offering companionship, alcohol, or financial incentives. Each interaction, whether culminating in victimization or not, provided valuable insight into human behavior, helping him refine strategies for control, isolation, and subjugation. Within the confines of his apartment, Dahmer's actions reflected meticulous planning and ritualization. Methods of sedation, restraint, and control were tested, refined, and documented mentally. His obsession with preservation, the desire to maintain dominance and manipulate mortality, became central to his internal logic. The apartments functioned as laboratories where theory met practice, and where experimentation with chemical sedatives, anatomical study, and containment techniques allowed him to perfect the mechanics of his crimes. These private rituals illustrate a calculated sophistication that extended beyond impulse or instinct. Psychologically, Dahmer's escalation was driven by a feedback loop in which gratification and compulsion reinforced each other. The internal reward from successful domination of victims strengthened his obsession, creating a self-reinforcing cycle that increased both the frequency and intensity of behavior. Each act confirmed that his fantasies could be realized, reinforcing the methods used and encouraging further experimentation. The relationship between mental rehearsal and enacted behavior became tightly interwoven, demonstrating a hallmark of organized serial offenders: the translation of internal obsession into increasingly methodical real-world practice. Alcohol and substance use continued to play a critical role in facilitating interactions and reducing inhibition. Dahmer employed alcohol to create a sense of trust and compliance in his targets, while simultaneously dulling his own moral and emotional restraints. This dual utility enhanced his ability to experiment safely, maintaining operational security while engaging in increasingly risky behavior. The combination of substance facilitation, methodical rehearsal, and social camouflage exemplifies the intersection of psychological compulsion and practical strategy that enabled prolonged criminal activity. By the late 1980s, Dahmer's behavior was characterized by ritualized patterns and obsessive repetition. Each step, from selection to isolation to subjugation to disposal, was rehearsed and refined. Even minor errors were analyzed internally, leading to modifications in technique. This iterative process of learning and refinement was central to his escalating confidence and efficiency. Dahmer was not simply acting on impulse. He was conducting a prolonged, deliberate program of experimentation designed to perfect the mechanics of control, manipulation, and preservation. The psychological compartmentalization that had served Dahmer so effectively continued to mature. He maintained a facade of ordinariness while internally navigating a highly organized and methodical criminal process. Neighbors and colleagues saw only the polite, quiet man who followed routine patterns, oblivious to the violent and obsessive activity concealed behind closed doors. This ability to maintain dual identities, publicly conventional, privately deviant, enabled him to persist in predation while avoiding suspicion, reinforcing both the feasibility and psychological reinforcement of repeated criminal acts. Dahmer's sexual fantasies were increasingly interwoven with control and preservation. The mental rehearsal of acts of dominance and manipulation became progressively detailed, and each act in reality served as a test of method, observation, and gratification. These intertwined motives, sexual, psychological, and procedural, created a comprehensive feedback system, reinforcing internal compulsions while simultaneously improving practical execution. Over time, the mental rehearsal of fantasy and real-world experimentation became indistinguishable in terms of motivation and purpose. Escalation during this period also reflected environmental factors. Milwaukee's urban landscape, with its pockets of anonymity, transient populations, and social invisibility, provided opportunity for repeated experimentation. The absence of immediate scrutiny allowed Dahmer to refine techniques, test boundaries, and increase frequency without fear of discovery. This alignment of psychological compulsion and environmental opportunity illustrates how serial predation can thrive when internal drive intersects with structural permissiveness. By the end of this period, Dahmer's criminal identity had fully consolidated. The combination of obsessive fantasy, meticulous planning, methodical experimentation, social camouflage, and environmental opportunity had created a highly organized predator capable of sustaining long-term criminal activity. The quiet neighbor image was not incidental. It was an operational tool, a mask that enabled him to navigate ordinary life while executing increasingly elaborate and violent behaviors in private. Milwaukee remained unaware, witnessing only the external calm while the internal machinery of obsession, ritual, and escalation operated with precision and secrecy. This stage of escalation underscores the mechanisms by which compulsion evolves into sustained criminal behavior. It highlights the iterative relationship between fantasy and execution, the reinforcing role of gratification, and the critical importance of social invisibility and environmental opportunity. Dahmer had progressed beyond experimentation into the realm of organized, methodical predation, a trajectory that would continue with tragic consequences for his victims and a profound impact on the understanding of serial criminal psychology. Chapter 7: Capturing the Pattern. Early investigations and close calls. By the early 1990s, Jeffrey Dahmer's actions had escalated to a point where patterns in victim selection, method, and timing were beginning to emerge. Yet despite the increasing frequency of his crimes, law enforcement investigations remained sporadic, incomplete, and hindered by both circumstance and systemic oversight. The interplay between Dahmer's meticulous planning, social invisibility, and subtle behavioral cues allowed him to continue predation even as the net of scrutiny began to tighten. Examining these early investigations and the near misses they produced provides insight into the complexity of detecting organized serial offenders and the fragile balance between perpetration and exposure. Dahmer's approach was increasingly methodical, involving careful selection of victims based on vulnerability, opportunity, and the likelihood of delayed detection. Individuals who were young, socially marginalized, transient, or disengaged from family structures were the most frequent targets. This methodical selection not only minimized immediate risk but also provided law enforcement with delayed reports, often leaving the link between missing persons unclear. These patterns illustrate the dual layers of Dahmer's operation: internal compulsion and external strategy, with the goal of sustaining uninterrupted predation while mitigating exposure. One notable aspect of this period was Dahmer's ability to adapt to increasing risk. He observed social and environmental patterns, adjusting his methods to reduce suspicion and reinforce concealment. For instance, he modified approaches to luring victims, became increasingly cautious in transporting them to private spaces, and refined techniques for controlling and immobilizing targets. Each minor adaptation, whether informed by near discovery or internal reflection, contributed to the sophistication of his methodology. This adaptability demonstrates the dynamic interaction between offender behavior and external pressures, a hallmark of highly organized serial predation. Several early encounters brought Dahmer close to detection but did not result in his apprehension. Instances involving neighbors noticing suspicious activity, police responding to reports of disturbances, and acquaintances expressing concern were mitigated through calculated deception, manipulation, or exploitation of social norms. Dahmer's outward demeanor, polite, compliant, and socially unobtrusive, played a critical role in deflecting suspicion. Law enforcement officers often relied on surface-level observations and initial impressions, which in Dahmer's case consistently underestimated the underlying risk. These close calls demonstrate both the challenge of detecting concealed offenders and the effectiveness of psychological camouflage. The coordination, or lack thereof, among law enforcement agencies further contributed to Dahmer's continued freedom. Missing persons reports were fragmented, often involving transient or marginalized populations whose absences did not trigger immediate, coordinated response. Investigations frequently lacked the continuity necessary to link disparate incidents, enabling Dahmer's pattern to remain hidden. This systemic vulnerability underscores how environmental, social, and procedural factors can intersect with criminal behavior, creating conditions in which an organized predator can operate undetected for extended periods. Dahmer's own behavior during this phase reflected acute awareness of risk. He employed methods designed to minimize exposure, including careful timing of interactions, selective isolation of victims, and tactical use of substances to gain compliance. He observed law enforcement responses, adjusted behavior in public spaces, and maintained routines that reinforced social normalcy. The combination of tactical awareness, meticulous planning, and psychological camouflage made him a particularly challenging subject for early detection, illustrating how organized offenders exploit both social and procedural gaps. Psychologically, Dahmer's ability to operate amid near discoveries reinforced internal compulsions and confidence. Each close encounter validated the effectiveness of secrecy, ritual, and deception, further embedding patterns of control and experimentation. These near misses provided feedback that sharpened operational precision, strengthened psychological reinforcement, and reduced perceived barriers to future action. In essence, the very risk of detection became a catalyst for refinement rather than deterrence. The victims themselves were often overlooked within systemic blind spots. Many were individuals on the margins of social visibility, homeless, transient, or estranged from family networks, whose disappearances were either delayed in reporting or deprioritized. This created an environment in which Dahmer's actions could continue without immediate scrutiny, allowing him to develop increasingly complex methods while law enforcement remained reactive rather than proactive. The intersection of social invisibility and procedural gaps underscores the vulnerability of certain populations to sustained predation. During this period, Dahmer's internal rituals also intensified. Beyond the practical mechanics of control, sedatives, and isolation, he engaged in elaborate mental rehearsals, imagining scenarios in which each act was perfected. These internal rehearsals not only reinforced compulsion but also served as cognitive preparation for real-world execution. The fusion of fantasy, planning, and observation created a self-reinforcing cycle, in which the imagination and reality became intertwined, producing escalating precision in both method and psychological gratification. Despite the dangers, Dahmer continued to operate in Milwaukee's neighborhoods without raising widespread suspicion. His polite demeanor, methodical daily routines, and avoidance of overtly aggressive behaviors created a protective mask, allowing him to integrate socially while privately executing increasingly organized predatory acts. The duality of existence, ordinary neighbor by day, calculating predator by night, was central to his ability to exploit social and procedural gaps while evading law enforcement intervention. The early 1990s illustrate a critical phase in the trajectory of serial offenders: escalation amid near detection. Dahmer's behavior demonstrates how organizational skill, environmental awareness, psychological compartmentalization, and adaptive learning converge to sustain criminal activity. The interplay between his internal compulsions and external constraints shaped a pattern in which risk, experimentation, and refinement coexisted, illustrating the mechanisms by which even repeated near misses fail to deter highly organized offenders. By examining these early investigations and close calls, it becomes evident that Dahmer's continued predation was not merely a result of luck. It was a product of meticulous planning, psychological reinforcement, social camouflage, and exploitation of systemic gaps. Milwaukee's quiet neighbor had, through both strategy and opportunity, maintained an active predatory presence, setting the stage for the intensified crimes and broader public attention that would follow. Following the initial near detections, Jeffrey Dahmer continued to operate with increased sophistication and caution, further solidifying patterns that would define the remaining years of his predatory activity. Each encounter, whether leading to an actual crime or a narrowly avoided detection, became a data point in a psychological and operational feedback loop, informing future actions. This period demonstrates the chilling combination of calculated methodology, psychological reinforcement, and exploitation of social and procedural blind spots that allowed Dahmer to evade capture for years. Dahmer's awareness of law enforcement limitations was acute. He observed police procedures, public response to disturbances, and social assumptions regarding missing persons, integrating this knowledge into his methods. For instance, understanding that transient individuals were less likely to generate immediate investigation, he increasingly targeted men with minimal social connections. He adjusted timing, locations, and approaches to reduce risk, demonstrating adaptive behavior and operational intelligence. These adjustments highlight the iterative learning process that is characteristic of organized serial offenders, in which each act informs refinement of technique. Despite occasional suspicious circumstances, such as neighbors reporting odd odors, unusual noises, or suspicious behavior, Dahmer successfully navigated social scrutiny. He relied on a combination of politeness, submission to authority, and inconspicuous behavior to deflect suspicion. In situations where police or civilians expressed concern, he often provided plausible explanations or evaded questions entirely, using social norms and expectations to his advantage. This capacity for deception underscores the psychological sophistication underlying his apparent ordinariness. The role of victim invisibility continued to facilitate Dahmer's operations. Many of his targets were socially marginalized, estranged from family or transient, which meant that delays in reporting disappearances were common. Law enforcement, already constrained by fragmented reporting systems and overburdened resources, often struggled to connect missing person reports to a single perpetrator. Dahmer exploited these structural and social gaps, understanding intuitively that his methodical selection reduced the probability of immediate detection. This intersection of personal compulsion and environmental opportunity created a sustained operational advantage. During this period, Dahmer's internal rituals and experimental methods became increasingly complex. He refined techniques for chemical sedation, physical restraint, and containment, while mentally rehearsing scenarios to ensure control and minimize risk. These rituals were not merely functional. They provided psychological satisfaction and reinforced a sense of mastery. Each successful exercise, whether enacted fully or partially, strengthened compulsions and contributed to the evolution of increasingly precise behavioral patterns. The apartments he inhabited functioned as laboratories, where both practical skills and psychological gratification were systematically cultivated. Sexual compulsion and control were intertwined with methodological experimentation. Dahmer's fantasies had evolved into detailed cognitive scenarios in which sexual gratification was inseparable from domination, isolation, and preservation. Rehearsing these scenarios internally reinforced confidence and refined technique, blurring the line between imagination and execution. The psychological interplay between gratification and control became a driving force behind the escalation of both frequency and sophistication in his predatory behavior. Law enforcement's early investigative challenges also illustrate systemic limitations. Reports of missing men were often treated in isolation, with little coordination across precincts or databases. Marginalized victims, such as homeless individuals or those with limited social support, were disproportionately overlooked. These vulnerabilities created conditions in which Dahmer's patterns could continue without immediate consequence. Each uninvestigated disappearance and delayed response provided him with tacit reinforcement, allowing the operational cycle to continue with minimal disruption. Several incidents brought Dahmer dangerously close to detection but ultimately reinforced his tactical approach. Witness reports, minor police encounters, and socially observed irregularities served as learning experiences, prompting adjustments in behavior, timing, and method. These near misses illustrate the adaptive intelligence of organized serial offenders, highlighting the importance of observation, reflection, and refinement in sustaining long-term predatory activity. Far from deterring him, these incidents reinforced the efficacy of careful planning and concealment. Dahmer's continued social camouflage remained central to his evasion. Neighbors, co-workers, and casual acquaintances consistently perceived him as polite, quiet, and routine-oriented. This ordinary appearance masked extraordinary pathology, allowing him to blend into the social fabric while engaging in increasingly sophisticated predation. His mastery of social norms, combined with compartmentalization and operational awareness, created a protective shield that allowed dangerous behavior to proceed unchecked. By the mid-1990s, the convergence of psychological reinforcement, social invisibility, and environmental opportunity had enabled Dahmer to sustain and escalate his criminal activity. The early investigations, fragmented and reactive, provided insight into patterns without disrupting operations. Dahmer's calculated adjustments to risk, meticulous experimentation, and psychological compartmentalization had created a system in which each act reinforced both skill and compulsion, setting the stage for the eventual tragic public exposure of his crimes. This phase in Milwaukee's history highlights the complex interplay between offender behavior, systemic limitations, and environmental factors. Dahmer's ability to evade capture was not merely a product of luck. It was a result of careful planning, psychological sophistication, and exploitation of social and procedural blind spots. Understanding these dynamics offers critical insight into the mechanisms that allow organized serial offenders to operate undetected and the structural vulnerabilities that can facilitate prolonged predation. Chapter 8: Escalation Intensified. Modus operandi and rituals. By the early 1990s, Jeffrey Dahmer's pattern of predation had intensified to a chilling degree, characterized by a precise and ritualized modus operandi. Each act followed a structured sequence, merging opportunity, psychological compulsion, and practical execution in a manner that reflected both obsession and operational sophistication. The escalation was not simply a matter of frequency. It represented the refinement of technique, experimentation with control, and deepening entanglement of sexual gratification and violence. Understanding Dahmer's rituals and methods at this stage provides critical insight into the systematic nature of organized serial offenders and the mechanisms by which internal compulsion translates into repeated, methodical action. Dahmer's approach to victim selection became increasingly strategic. He targeted men and boys who were socially marginalized, often from vulnerable populations, including runaways, transient individuals, or those estranged from family. The choice of victims was guided by an acute awareness of visibility and risk. Dahmer understood intuitively that selecting individuals whose absences would attract minimal attention increased his operational security. Each interaction was preceded by subtle observation, establishing patterns of trust or exploiting vulnerabilities. The result was a chillingly methodical approach that combined instinct, observation, and meticulous calculation. The execution of his crimes followed a rigid ritual. Dahmer would first identify and approach a target, often using alcohol, companionship, or promises of payment to gain compliance. This initial stage was carefully rehearsed, allowing him to assess willingness and potential resistance. Once isolated, he employed techniques of chemical sedation and physical restraint, calibrated to ensure control while minimizing the risk of struggle or attention. These procedures reflected extensive experimentation and internal rehearsal, demonstrating that his acts were neither impulsive nor haphazard but carefully orchestrated sequences designed for both efficiency and psychological gratification. Central to Dahmer's modus operandi was the theme of control. Each stage of interaction, from initial contact to post-mortem activities, was dominated by an obsessive desire to assert mastery over life, death, and behavior. Control was not only practical but symbolic, representing the culmination of fantasies that had evolved over decades. Preservation and manipulation of victims extended beyond initial physical subjugation, often involving complex rituals in which chemical sedatives, confinement, and post-mortem handling were meticulously applied. These actions illustrate the intersection of compulsion, methodical practice, and the desire for mastery that defined his criminal psychology. Dahmer's internal rituals also intensified during this phase. Prior to engaging with a victim, he frequently engaged in elaborate mental rehearsal, visualizing sequences of interaction, control, and gratification in precise detail. These rehearsals were iterative, informed by past successes and failures, and served as both psychological preparation and cognitive reinforcement. The mental rehearsal of acts merged with practical experimentation, creating a feedback loop in which fantasy and reality were intertwined, each reinforcing the other in an escalating cycle of compulsion and methodical execution. Alcohol continued to function as both a social and operational tool. Dahmer used it to lower inhibition in his victims, gain trust, and facilitate compliance. Simultaneously, it allowed him to manage internal tension, suppress moral and emotional restraints, and focus on execution. The dual role of alcohol, social lubricant and facilitator of compulsion, highlighted the integration of psychological strategy and practical methodology in his approach. It was a critical component in bridging the gap between fantasy and actionable execution, enabling him to sustain increasingly risky interactions without compromise. During this period, Dahmer began experimenting more extensively with preservation techniques. Fascination with the permanence of control, informed by earlier anatomical curiosity, evolved into methods involving chemical treatment, restraint, and containment of body parts. These practices were ritualistic, reflecting both internal obsession and methodological refinement. Each experiment served dual purposes: satisfying psychological compulsion and providing practical experience for improving techniques. The apartments Dahmer inhabited became laboratories where private experimentation merged seamlessly with the enactment of violent fantasy. Social camouflage remained central to Dahmer's ability to continue predation. Outwardly, he maintained the image of a polite, inconspicuous neighbor, blending seamlessly into daily routines. This ordinariness was not accidental. It was a deliberate strategy to mitigate risk. By appearing compliant, routine-oriented, and socially unthreatening, Dahmer minimized suspicion while sustaining a pattern of repeated predation. His mastery of compartmentalization allowed him to maintain dual identities: an ordinary adult in public and a meticulously organized predator in private. The escalation of ritualized behavior also reflected an iterative learning process. Each successful act informed the next, with refinements in technique, timing, and psychological manipulation. Failures or near misses were analyzed internally, resulting in adjustments to operational procedures. This iterative process demonstrates the sophisticated interaction between compulsion, reflection, and adaptation that characterizes organized serial offenders. Over time, Dahmer's rituals became both predictable to him and terrifyingly precise, allowing repeated execution with minimal risk of external detection. By the early 1990s, the intersection of opportunity, compulsion, and methodical ritual had transformed Dahmer into a predator of chilling organization. His pattern was no longer experimental. It had become codified, efficient, and ritualized. The escalation intensified the fusion of fantasy and reality, creating a cycle in which mental rehearsal, practical experimentation, and psychological gratification reinforced each other. Milwaukee's quiet neighbor, once socially unremarkable, had now become a master of operational concealment, a calculated manipulator of human vulnerability, and a methodical practitioner of predation whose activities would soon shock the nation. As Jeffrey Dahmer's predatory behavior progressed into the early 1990s, the integration of ritual, methodical execution, and obsessive control reached unprecedented levels. The escalation was no longer limited to opportunistic encounters. It had become a meticulously organized process that combined psychological gratification, operational efficiency, and absolute concealment. Each act was both a reinforcement of compulsion and a rehearsal for future interactions, creating a self-perpetuating cycle that intensified both the sophistication and the horror of his crimes. Dahmer's modus operandi during this period was characterized by predictability in execution and variability in selection. While his procedures remained ritualized, initial engagement, sedation, restraint, and eventual post-mortem handling, his victims were chosen for specific vulnerabilities that minimized risk of immediate detection. These included young men with limited social ties, those estranged from family, or individuals on the margins of social systems. The deliberate pairing of methodical procedure with strategic selection exemplifies the calculated nature of his actions, combining internal compulsion with environmental awareness. Within the private confines of his apartment, Dahmer's rituals became increasingly elaborate. Each act involved precise physical manipulation, including chemical sedation, restraint, and controlled positioning of the victim. Post-mortem procedures reflected both anatomical curiosity and psychological reinforcement, with practices designed to extend control and create a sense of permanence. His experiments with preservation, whether through chemical means or positioning of remains, demonstrate the intersection of obsession, ritual, and methodical refinement, highlighting how the interplay between internal compulsion and practical experimentation intensified over time. Psychologically, this period underscores the role of feedback loops in the escalation of organized predatory behavior. Each successful execution reinforced internal compulsions, validating fantasies and strengthening confidence in methods. Close calls and near detections, rather than deterring Dahmer, served as adaptive lessons, prompting refinements in approach, concealment, and timing. The iterative nature of this process created a cycle in which mental rehearsal, practical execution, and psychological reinforcement became inseparable, fueling increasingly sophisticated criminal behavior. Alcohol remained a critical facilitator. Dahmer used it strategically to gain compliance from his targets, reduce resistance, and smooth interactions. It also provided psychological insulation, dulling anxiety, guilt, or hesitation that might interfere with execution. The combination of social manipulation, substance use, and operational control reflects an integrated strategy in which multiple reinforcing mechanisms supported sustained criminal activity. Alcohol was not a mere vice but a tactical instrument that bridged fantasy and actionable behavior. The consolidation of ritual also included mental preparation and rehearsal. Dahmer would visualize sequences in exact detail, anticipating potential complications and refining responses. This cognitive rehearsal served dual purposes: reinforcing psychological gratification and preparing for operational challenges. Over time, the rehearsal and actual execution of acts became functionally identical in motivation and method, demonstrating the profound intertwining of imagination and reality that characterizes organized serial predation. Social invisibility continued to be a critical factor in Dahmer's sustained activity. Outwardly, he maintained the image of a quiet, polite, and inconspicuous neighbor, avoiding behaviors that could attract attention. This social camouflage allowed him to integrate seamlessly into his environment, deflecting suspicion even when engaged in increasingly extreme behaviors. The effectiveness of this duality, external ordinariness paired with internal pathology, was reinforced by systemic and social blind spots, enabling Dahmer to operate undetected for years. Each iteration of ritualized behavior allowed for refinement of method and enhancement of control. Failures, hesitations, or unexpected reactions were incorporated into future procedures, demonstrating adaptive intelligence and operational sophistication. This iterative process illustrates the calculated and deliberate nature of escalation, emphasizing that Dahmer's actions were neither impulsive nor unstructured but the result of years of experiential learning, cognitive rehearsal, and obsessive refinement. By the mid-1990s, Dahmer had transformed from an experimental predator into a master of operational ritual. Each act was carefully choreographed, combining selection, manipulation, control, and concealment. Fantasy and reality were fully integrated, with each successful execution reinforcing compulsions, refining methods, and strengthening psychological reinforcement. The escalation of ritualized behavior demonstrates the fusion of psychological obsession, methodical planning, and environmental opportunity, creating a cycle of predation that was both relentless and increasingly precise. The culmination of this phase highlights the terrifying efficacy of Dahmer's approach. Milwaukee's quiet neighbor, once socially invisible and seemingly unremarkable, had become a meticulously organized predator, capable of sustained and escalating acts of violence. His rituals were not merely methods of crime but extensions of psychological compulsion, integrating control, sexual gratification, and operational refinement in a self-reinforcing cycle. This phase of escalation set the stage for the eventual unraveling of his crimes and the exposure of a pattern that had been meticulously hidden in plain sight, shocking both the community and the nation. Chapter 9 Signs Ignored, the Community and Missed Warnings. By the mid-1990s, Jeffrey Dahmer's pattern of predation in Milwaukee had escalated to a highly organized and ritualized cycle, yet the community around him remained largely unaware of the danger. The city, bustling and diverse, offered anonymity to those who could blend seamlessly into daily routines, and Dahmer exploited this social invisibility to devastating effect. Despite subtle warning signs, missed opportunities for intervention were frequent, illustrating how social assumptions, systemic gaps, and the ordinariness of appearances can mask extreme deviance. Understanding the community's role and the missed signals provides critical insight into how serial predation persists unnoticed. Neighbors, co-workers, and casual acquaintances consistently describe Dahmer as quiet, polite, and unremarkable. On the surface, his life resembled that of any solitary individual navigating the routines of urban living. He shopped at local stores, managed personal errands, and maintained regular patterns of behavior that projected normalcy. This outward facade was crucial, as it leveraged deeply ingrained social expectations. People rarely suspect those who are unobtrusive, compliant, and routine-oriented. Dahmer's mastery of social camouflage allowed him to exploit both familiarity and trust, reducing the likelihood of intervention even when subtle anomalies were observed. Subtle warning signs were present but largely unheeded. Neighbors occasionally noticed unusual odors emanating from his apartment, intermittent disturbances, or the comings and goings of unfamiliar men. In some cases, friends of victims expressed concern over sudden disappearances, yet these reports were fragmented and lacked urgency, particularly when the individuals involved were socially marginalized or transient. The social invisibility of Dahmer's victims intersected tragically with the invisibility of warning signs, creating a feedback loop in which risk signals were diffused and deprioritized. Systemic factors also played a significant role. Law enforcement agencies faced challenges in linking missing persons cases, particularly when reports involved individuals on the margins of society. Limited communication across departments, fragmented documentation, and procedural gaps allowed patterns to go unrecognized. This systemic vulnerability created conditions in which a methodical predator like Dahmer could operate with minimal interference. His understanding of these gaps further reinforced the effectiveness of his operational concealment, demonstrating the interaction between offender strategy and institutional limitation. Within the community, assumptions about social norms contributed to missed warnings. People tend to interpret unusual behavior through the lens of ordinary context, often discounting anomalies that do not immediately appear threatening. Dahmer's polite demeanor, predictable routines, and quiet presence reinforced these assumptions, allowing him to evade suspicion. In essence, his conformity to social expectations acted as both camouflage and a psychological shield, illustrating how societal perception can be manipulated by outward appearances. At the same time, Dahmer's own internal rituals continued to intensify. Mental rehearsals, methodical experimentation, and strategic refinements in approach were coupled with increasing confidence in evading detection. Close calls and minor disturbances did not deter him. Rather, they informed tactical adjustments. The interplay between internal compulsion, experiential learning, and social camouflage created a reinforcing cycle, in which each success validated the methods and each near-miss refined them further. The marginalized status of many victims compounded the likelihood of missed warnings. Young men without strong family ties, homeless individuals, and socially isolated persons were disproportionately affected. Reports of their disappearance were often delayed or treated with less urgency, allowing Dahmer extended operational freedom. This intersection of social invisibility and systemic neglect exemplifies how structural and social factors can inadvertently facilitate predation, highlighting vulnerabilities in both community awareness and institutional response. Dahmer's ability to navigate these dynamics underscores the psychological sophistication underlying his outward normalcy. He understood the boundaries of social attention, the assumptions of his neighbors, and the limitations of law enforcement, and he leveraged this knowledge to operate undetected. The contrast between his internal obsession and the community's perception created a stark duality. A man whose outward appearance was unremarkable yet whose private actions were calculated, ritualized, and increasingly violent. Alcohol and social manipulation remained central to his interactions. By offering companionship or alcohol to potential victims, Dahmer could lower resistance, create dependency, and isolate targets effectively. These interactions, carefully controlled and strategically executed, were extensions of his broader modus operandi, combining social compliance with operational safety. Each act reinforced confidence in methods, strengthened compulsions, and contributed to the escalating cycle of predation. Even when confronted with minor suspicions, Dahmer demonstrated an acute ability to deflect attention. He relied on politeness, plausible explanations, and adherence to routine, exploiting societal assumptions about the harmlessness of ordinary individuals. This mastery of social deception allowed him to continue rituals without disruption, even as subtle warning signs accumulated around him. The community's inability to perceive danger amidst routine highlights the tragic intersection of social invisibility and methodical criminal behavior. The cumulative effect of missed warnings and unheeded signals illustrates the complexity of serial predation in urban environments. Dahmer's ability to maintain social camouflage, combined with systemic and community blind spots, allowed him to escalate rituals, refine techniques, and sustain prolonged predatory activity. Understanding these dynamics sheds light on the interplay between offender sophistication, social perception, and institutional limitation, providing crucial context for how extraordinary criminal behavior can remain hidden in plain sight. By the mid-1990s, Milwaukee had become a city unknowingly coexisting with one of the most methodical and ritualized predators in modern history. Dahmer's quiet exterior masked a life of escalating obsession, and the missed warnings, subtle odors, transient victims, fragmented reports, illustrated how social assumptions and systemic gaps can obscure danger. The community, despite proximity and occasional hints, remained largely unaware, enabling a cycle of predation that would continue until dramatic events forced the truth into the open. As Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes continued in Milwaukee, the signs of his escalating behavior remained present, yet largely unnoticed or misunderstood by the surrounding community. This period reveals the profound impact of social invisibility, systemic gaps, and the deceptive power of ordinariness in concealing extraordinary deviance. Despite increasingly disturbing evidence, ranging from unexplained odors to the suspicious behavior of visitors. The interplay of societal assumptions and institutional limitations allowed Dahmer to continue his predatory actions with relative impunity. Neighbors occasionally reported strange occurrences. Men entering and leaving Dahmer's apartment at irregular hours, intermittent and unpleasant odors, or brief disturbances that hinted at unusual activity. In many cases, these observations were either dismissed as mundane urban irregularities or explained away by Dahmer's plausible social facade. People rarely anticipated that a quiet, polite, and seemingly routine neighbor could be engaged in acts of extreme violence. This reflects a fundamental limitation in human perception. Social norms and expectations can mask abnormal behavior, making the extraordinary invisible when embedded within the ordinary. Systemic challenges further compounded the invisibility of Dahmer's crimes. Police investigations of missing persons often lacked coordination, particularly when victims were from marginalized populations. Homeless individuals, runaways, or socially isolated men frequently had delayed or incomplete reports, preventing the establishment of patterns. Additionally, communication gaps between departments and inconsistent follow-up allowed discrete incidents to remain unconnected, giving the impression of isolated disappearances rather than a sustained criminal pattern. Dahmer's awareness of these limitations enhanced his ability to exploit them, highlighting the interaction between criminal strategy and systemic vulnerability. Even close calls with detection often served to reinforce Dahmer's methodology rather than deter it. Minor incidents, such as concerned neighbors or brief police interventions, prompted adjustments in his approach, including more careful timing, selective targeting, and refined methods of gaining compliance. These near discoveries became opportunities for adaptive learning, allowing Dahmer to anticipate potential risks and refine his operational techniques. This demonstrates the sophisticated feedback loop in which risk, observation, and refinement combine to increase the efficiency and safety of predatory activity. The social invisibility of his victims played a central role in allowing these patterns to continue. Individuals who were transient, estranged from family, or socially marginalized were less likely to prompt immediate investigation, creating an environment where disappearances could go unnoticed. This systemic vulnerability, combined with Dahmer's social camouflage, created a persistent operational advantage. The absence of rapid detection and the fragmented reporting of missing persons facilitated repeated actions without interruption, enabling escalation both in frequency and complexity. Dahmer's internal rituals continued to evolve alongside these external dynamics. Mental rehearsals, strategic planning, and obsessive reflection became increasingly intricate, reinforcing both compulsion and methodological sophistication. The cognitive preparation for each interaction allowed him to anticipate challenges, manage risk, and maximize control, creating a seamless integration between fantasy and execution. The apartments he inhabited functioned as laboratories in which these rituals were refined and repeated, underscoring the interplay between obsession, methodical practice, and operational efficiency. Social norms and assumptions further shielded Dahmer from scrutiny. His outward appearance, polite, routine-oriented, and non-confrontational, allowed observers to interpret anomalies through benign explanations. The human tendency to normalize unusual behavior provided a protective layer, enabling him to sustain patterns of predation even as warning signs accumulated. This illustrates the danger of relying solely on observable behavior without considering underlying risks or systemic blind spots. Alcohol and social manipulation remained essential tools. Dahmer employed alcohol strategically to facilitate compliance, build trust, and isolate targets. These interactions were calculated and consistent with his broader operational approach, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of social psychology. Each successful interaction reinforced both confidence and compulsion, contributing to the escalating cycle of predation that defined his modus operandi by the mid-1990s. Dahmer's combination of social camouflage, ritualized methodology, and exploitation of systemic and community blind spots allowed him to maintain operational freedom while increasingly refining his practices. Despite subtle signs, suspicious behaviors, odors, and fragmented missing persons reports, Milwaukee's community largely remained unaware. This period exemplifies the intersection of individual pathology, social perception, and institutional vulnerability, demonstrating how organized predation can persist amid seemingly ordinary surroundings. Ultimately, the ignored warnings of the community highlight a critical theme in the study of serial offenders. Extraordinary deviance can coexist with ordinary appearances, and systemic limitations can inadvertently facilitate prolonged predation. Dahmer's ability to exploit these dynamics enabled him to escalate both the frequency and sophistication of his crimes, creating a cycle of violence that would continue until external intervention became unavoidable. The combination of human perception limitations, structural gaps, and meticulous criminal strategy created a situation in which a quiet neighbor could conceal a horrific double life, leaving devastating consequences in his wake. Chapter 10: Psychological Profile. Understanding Dahmer's mind. Jeffrey Dahmer's criminal behavior cannot be fully understood without examining the intricate workings of his mind. By the mid-1990s, his predatory patterns, obsessive rituals, and methodical approach had solidified into a consistent cycle of behavior, but underlying these actions were complex psychological dynamics that shaped his thoughts, compulsions, and motivations. Studying Dahmer's mental landscape provides insight into how fantasy, compulsion, trauma, and personality interacted to produce a highly organized predator, and how such internal mechanisms can exist unnoticed behind a facade of social normalcy. Dahmer's childhood and adolescence laid the foundation for many of the behaviors that would later manifest in adulthood. Reports from family and acquaintances indicate early signs of social isolation, fascination with death, and difficulty forming meaningful relationships. While these traits alone would not predict violent behavior, they contributed to a personality prone to internalization of fantasy, emotional detachment, and obsessive thought patterns. This combination created fertile ground for the emergence of a psychological compulsion that would later be expressed through extreme criminal acts. Sexual fantasy played a central role in Dahmer's psychological structure. From adolescence, he exhibited a fixation on control, domination, and manipulation, often intertwining sexual desire with themes of power and permanence. These fantasies were not fleeting. They were deeply rehearsed, intricate, and mentally detailed. Over time, they evolved into a cognitive blueprint, forming the foundation for later real-world experimentation. The intense internalization of these fantasies demonstrates the profound interplay between desire, imagination, and subsequent behavior in the formation of compulsive criminal activity. Compulsion and reinforcement were integral to Dahmer's psychological cycle. Each successful act of predation reinforced internal desires, validating the mental rehearsal and increasing confidence in operational methods. The combination of gratification and reinforcement strengthened the connection between fantasy and reality, producing a feedback loop in which mental rehearsal, real-world execution, and psychological satisfaction became inseparable. This dynamic illustrates how deeply ingrained compulsions can evolve from internal fantasy into methodical, repeated criminal behavior. Psychological compartmentalization was another defining feature of Dahmer's mind. He maintained an outward appearance of normalcy, blending into social structures while privately engaging in increasingly extreme behaviors. This duality allowed him to interact with neighbors, coworkers, and acquaintances without arousing suspicion, creating a protective layer that insulated the private manifestation of pathology. Compartmentalization not only facilitated operational security but also allowed Dahmer to navigate internal moral and social conflicts, maintaining cognitive equilibrium while pursuing compulsive desires. Dahmer's fascination with control extended beyond the immediate act of predation to encompass themes of permanence and possession. His experimentation with preservation, dismemberment, and containment reflects a psychological need to exert dominance over life, death, and memory. This obsession was not merely instrumental. It was symbolic, representing mastery over vulnerability and mortality. Such behavior aligns with traits observed in highly organized offenders, where control and ritual serve as extensions of psychological compulsion rather than purely opportunistic actions. Social and environmental awareness further reinforced his psychological framework. Dahmer understood which individuals were vulnerable, how to exploit trust, and the limits of social attention. This situational awareness interacted with internal compulsions to create an efficient operational system. He learned from near detections, adapted methods, and refined behavioral patterns in response to risk, demonstrating a level of cognitive sophistication that complemented his obsessive fantasies. The integration of psychological compulsion with environmental strategy was central to his ability to sustain predatory behavior over time. Substance use, particularly alcohol, was not incidental but instrumental in Dahmer's psychological processes. Alcohol facilitated compliance from victims, reduced social friction, and provided an internal mechanism to manage tension and moral conflict. Its strategic use reflects a deep understanding of both social and psychological dynamics, further illustrating the interplay between internal compulsion, environmental manipulation, and methodical execution. Dahmer's internal rituals were as significant as his outward actions. Mental rehearsal, cognitive visualization, and obsessive reflection allowed him to anticipate, plan, and refine interactions with victims. These rituals provided psychological gratification independent of actual execution, reinforcing desire while enhancing operational skill. The fusion of fantasy and real-world planning exemplifies the cognitive architecture of organized serial offenders, where compulsive imagination and pragmatic execution converge in escalating cycles of behavior. The psychological profile of Dahmer also highlights the role of early experiences and individual temperament in shaping the capacity for sustained predatory behavior. Social isolation, fascination with death, and obsessive fantasy provided a foundation that, combined with cognitive reinforcement, compartmentalization, and adaptive learning, allowed deviant behaviors to escalate over time. Understanding these dynamics is essential for comprehending how complex psychological structures underlie organized serial predation and how they can remain hidden behind a veneer of social ordinariness. By analyzing Dahmer's mind, it becomes clear that his crimes were not the result of mere impulse or opportunism. They were the product of an intricate interplay between compulsion, fantasy, environmental awareness, and methodical execution. The duality of his existence, socially unremarkable yet privately obsessive, illustrates the terrifying potential for organized predation to coexist with outward normalcy, setting the stage for the continuation and intensification of his criminal patterns. As Jeffrey Dahmer's criminal behavior continued, the depth and complexity of his psychological landscape became increasingly evident. His compulsions, fantasies, and methodical rituals were not isolated phenomena, but interconnected elements that created a self-reinforcing cycle of behavior. By examining the cognitive, emotional, and behavioral components of Dahmer's psyche, one can better understand the mechanisms that enabled sustained predation, the fusion of fantasy and reality, and the profound disconnect between outward normalcy and internal pathology. Central to Dahmer's psychological makeup was the interplay between fantasy and execution. From adolescence, he engaged in elaborate mental rehearsals, imagining scenarios of control, domination, and permanence with extreme detail. These fantasies provided both gratification and cognitive practice, serving as rehearsal for real-world actions. Over time, the mental and physical aspects of his crimes became inseparable. The act of preying upon victims was a continuation of long-cultivated internal scripts. The intensity and precision of these mental rehearsals highlight the extraordinary focus and obsessive cognition characteristic of organized serial offenders. Compulsion functioned as the primary driver of Dahmer's behavior. Each successful act reinforced internal desire, validating mental rehearsal and increasing confidence in operational methods. The repeated fulfillment of fantasy through real-world execution strengthened neural pathways associated with gratification, obsession, and control, creating a feedback loop in which desire, action, and reinforcement were inseparable. This compulsion was highly resistant to external deterrence, allowing escalation even in the presence of risk or close calls with detection. Dahmer's use of compartmentalization was critical for maintaining outward normalcy while pursuing private pathology. He separated social life from criminal activity with precision, ensuring that neighbors, co-workers, and casual acquaintances perceived only ordinary behaviors. This psychological division enabled him to navigate moral and social expectations without cognitive dissonance interfering with predation. Compartmentalization also functioned as a protective mechanism, insulating the private expression of deviance from public scrutiny and enabling prolonged, methodical engagement in criminal activity. A recurring theme in Dahmer's psychological profile was the pursuit of control. His actions were not merely about sexual gratification or opportunistic predation. They represented a profound desire to dominate life, death, and vulnerability. Ritualized behaviors, including chemical sedation, physical restraint, and post-mortem handling, exemplified this pursuit. The acts of preservation, manipulation, and containment were both practical and symbolic, providing a tangible sense of mastery over his environment and his victims. This drive for absolute control distinguishes highly organized offenders from impulsive or opportunistic criminals, reflecting both obsession and operational sophistication. Dahmer's strategic use of social dynamics further illustrates the sophistication of his psychological approach. He carefully selected victims based on vulnerability, manipulated trust through alcohol or companionship, and maintained a facade of routine normalcy. This strategic awareness demonstrates that his predation was guided not solely by internal compulsion but also by careful observation and adaptation to environmental variables. Near misses, subtle warnings, or minor exposures prompted adjustments in approach, highlighting the cognitive flexibility and learning capacity that enabled sustained predatory behavior. Internal rituals remained central to psychological satisfaction. Mental rehearsal, reflection on prior acts, and visualization of future encounters reinforced both desire and skill. These rituals functioned independently of physical action, allowing gratification and operational refinement to occur simultaneously. The fusion of imagination and execution demonstrates the depth of compulsive behavior and the degree to which internal cognitive processes can drive external criminal activity. Substance use, particularly alcohol, served multiple psychological functions. It reduced inhibition in victims, facilitated compliance, and helped Dahmer manage his own emotional tension. By integrating substances into his operational strategy, he could maintain psychological equilibrium, mitigate internal conflict, and enhance the predictability of interactions. Alcohol was not incidental. It was a calculated tool that bridged mental preparation and physical execution. The psychological profile of Dahmer also underscores the role of early experiences, temperament, and social context in shaping sustained predatory behavior. Social isolation, obsessive fantasy, and fascination with death created conditions conducive to compulsive escalation. Combined with adaptive learning, cognitive rehearsal, and meticulous planning, these traits allowed organized criminal behavior to emerge and persist over time. The interaction between internal pathology and environmental opportunity was critical, demonstrating that both personal and systemic factors contributed to the longevity and escalation of his crimes. By examining Dahmer's mind, a pattern emerges. A complex, highly organized individual whose compulsions, fantasies, and operational sophistication created a seamless integration of imagination and execution. His ability to blend outward normalcy with private pathology enabled prolonged predation, while the feedback loops of reinforcement and refinement intensified both desire and methodical skill. Dahmer's psychological architecture reveals not only the mechanisms of his crimes, but also the terrifying potential for hidden deviance to persist behind ordinary appearances, shaping one of the most infamous predatory trajectories in modern history. Chapter 11: Detection at Last. Law enforcement closing in. By the mid-1990s, Jeffrey Dahmer's elaborate cycle of predation had escalated to a level that made his crimes increasingly difficult to conceal, despite his meticulous planning, social camouflage, and ritualized methods. While his earlier operations had benefited from systemic gaps, social invisibility, and the community's assumptions about normality, the convergence of repeated patterns, suspicious activities, and accumulating evidence eventually began to draw law enforcement scrutiny. This period marks the pivotal phase in which investigative focus intensified, and the trajectory of Dahmer's crimes shifted from prolonged concealment toward eventual detection. Law enforcement faced significant challenges in identifying Dahmer's activities. Missing persons reports were fragmented, often involving individuals from marginalized populations, transient residents, or socially isolated men. These factors delayed the recognition of patterns and limited the immediate urgency of investigations. Coordination between departments and the timely cross-referencing of reports were inconsistent, creating a system in which individual disappearances were treated as isolated incidents rather than potential indicators of a sustained criminal operation. Dahmer's awareness of these systemic vulnerabilities allowed him to exploit them effectively for years. However, by the mid-1990s, the frequency of disappearances and reports began to generate increased concern. Families of missing men, community members, and activists began pressing for more thorough investigations. Law enforcement, recognizing the potential for patterns, began scrutinizing neighborhood incidents and monitoring individuals associated with repeated absences. This marked a shift from reactive responses to attempts at proactive analysis, though coordination and data limitations still complicated the effort. In this transitional phase, Dahmer's sophisticated methods and careful social camouflage were tested against a slowly tightening investigative net. Dahmer's modus operandi, while highly organized, contained inherent traces of predictability that investigators began to detect. His pattern of selecting socially marginalized individuals, utilizing alcohol to gain compliance, isolating victims in private apartments, and conducting ritualized post-mortem activities had left subtle but identifiable behavioral signatures. By analyzing these consistencies, law enforcement sought to link cases, narrow investigative focus, and identify potential suspects. The emergence of these discernible patterns illustrates how even highly organized serial offenders leave behavioral fingerprints that, when recognized, can become the basis for detection. Community awareness played a growing role in the investigative process. Neighbors and acquaintances, previously unconcerned or hesitant, began reporting suspicious behaviors more frequently. Unusual odors, transient visitors, and the comings and goings of unfamiliar men were now viewed with increased suspicion. These community reports, when aggregated with missing persons data, contributed to a more comprehensive investigative framework. The collaboration between law enforcement and the community, although initially limited, represented a crucial factor in closing the operational gap that had long protected Dahmer. Technology and investigative techniques, while not as advanced as later decades, were gradually employed to identify potential patterns. Police began reviewing missing persons databases, cross-referencing reports, and conducting background checks on individuals linked to multiple cases. This systematic review enabled recognition of geographic clustering, temporal consistency, and demographic similarities among victims. Each analytical step highlighted vulnerabilities in Dahmer's operational approach, demonstrating that even meticulous concealment can be challenged through data aggregation, analytical rigor, and sustained observation. Dahmer's own behavior during this phase reflected both confidence and caution. Close calls, minor suspicions, and incidents of potential detection prompted subtle adjustments in approach, timing, and concealment. He carefully managed interactions with neighbors and potential witnesses, maintained social ordinariness, and continued to employ alcohol as a tool for compliance and distraction. These adaptive behaviors illustrate the dynamic interaction between a highly organized offender and the external pressure of emerging investigative attention, highlighting the iterative nature of risk management in prolonged predation. Investigative focus was further sharpened by the involvement of federal and local task forces specializing in missing persons and serial offenses. While initial coordination was fragmented, the recognition of repeating patterns prompted more deliberate data collection, stakeouts, and case consolidation. These efforts laid the groundwork for eventual identification of suspects and the narrowing of investigative priorities. The increasing pressure of systematic scrutiny marked a turning point in the trajectory of Dahmer's activities, introducing variables that had previously been absent in his operational environment. The role of law enforcement in this phase underscores the interplay between offender behavior, systemic capacity, and investigative methodology. Dahmer's prior success in evading detection was contingent not only on personal cunning, but also on procedural gaps, social invisibility, and the fragmented nature of case reporting. As these factors shifted through increased community awareness, procedural improvements, and focused investigative effort, the environment that had allowed sustained predation began to collapse, creating conditions in which detection became inevitable. This period in Dahmer's criminal timeline illustrates a crucial lesson in criminal investigation. Even highly organized offenders, whose patterns are meticulously concealed, can leave traces detectable through persistent, systematic analysis. The convergence of community reports, missing persons databases, behavioral consistency, and investigative coordination created a scenario in which the previously invisible predator became subject to scrutiny. The tightening net of law enforcement intervention set the stage for the dramatic culmination that would follow, transforming years of covert predation into a case that would shock the public and redefine serial crime awareness. As investigative pressure on Jeffrey Dahmer intensified in Milwaukee, the previously invisible threads of his criminal activity began to coalesce into actionable evidence. The convergence of law enforcement scrutiny, community reports, and emerging patterns of disappearances created a climate in which prolonged concealment was no longer sustainable. This phase highlights the delicate balance between offender sophistication and systemic response, demonstrating how meticulous planning and social camouflage can be challenged by persistent, coordinated investigative effort. Law enforcement strategies evolved as new leads emerged. Investigators began re-examining missing persons reports, seeking connections that had previously gone unnoticed. Similarities in victim profiles, geographic clustering, and temporal patterns provided a foundation for suspect identification. The aggregation of these cases marked a critical shift from reactive to proactive investigation, signaling that the cumulative weight of Dahmer's patterns could no longer remain invisible. Each piece of evidence, whether witness testimony, transient reports, or physical clues, added incremental pressure, shrinking the operational space Dahmer had long exploited. The role of witness observation became increasingly important. Neighbors, co-workers, and acquaintances who had previously dismissed subtle signs were now reporting unusual activities with heightened concern. Accounts of unfamiliar men visiting Dahmer's apartment, intermittent unpleasant odors, and other minor anomalies became focal points for law enforcement. These seemingly small details, when systematically aggregated, provided critical context, illustrating how community awareness can serve as a powerful tool in detecting concealed criminal behavior. Despite growing investigative attention, Dahmer continued to rely on his methods of concealment and adaptation. He maintained the appearance of a quiet, ordinary neighbor while adjusting operational behaviors to reduce risk. Timing, selection of victims, and interaction strategies were subtly modified to account for increased vigilance. This adaptive sophistication illustrates the dynamic interplay between offender and environment, emphasizing how organized predators continuously assess risk and refine methods in response to external pressures. Investigators also began to explore technological avenues, including cross-referencing police records and scrutinizing prior complaints or unusual incidents. Although resources and technology in the early 1990s were limited compared to contemporary standards, these efforts enabled identification of recurring patterns, geographic links, and demographic consistencies among victims. Each discovery narrowed the field of potential suspects and underscored the power of methodical investigative persistence in overcoming complex criminal concealment. The psychological toll on law enforcement during this period was considerable. Investigators confronted a combination of social invisibility, fragmented reporting, and the deliberate deception of a highly organized offender. Each new piece of evidence raised both operational questions and ethical considerations, including how to prioritize resources, assess risk, and protect potential victims. This environment demanded both analytical rigor and human judgment, highlighting the complex nature of investigating sophisticated serial offenders. Dahmer's own responses to mounting investigative attention reveal the interplay between internal compulsion and environmental stress. While his rituals and compulsions continued, he became increasingly cautious in operational execution, aware that detection was a growing threat. This phase demonstrates that even highly compulsive individuals are capable of strategic adjustment, particularly when survival instincts intersect with obsessive drives. The combination of compulsion, tactical adaptation, and risk assessment defines the nuanced behavior of organized serial offenders under pressure. Collaboration between law enforcement and community members became crucial. Reports from concerned neighbors, statements from acquaintances of missing men, and the identification of recurring suspicious behaviors provided investigators with actionable intelligence. This collaborative approach, though often delayed by earlier systemic gaps, exemplifies how persistent observation and communication between institutions and communities can overcome the advantage previously held by covert offenders. By the late stages of this period, the net around Dahmer began to tighten significantly. Each investigative advance, whether through pattern recognition, witness reporting, or procedural review, reduced the operational latitude he had previously enjoyed. The combination of methodological scrutiny, social awareness, and procedural persistence marked the tipping point, where concealment could no longer fully shield him from scrutiny. This impending detection underscores a critical principle in criminal investigation. Even highly organized, adaptive offenders are vulnerable to sustained, systematic observation, and coordinated action. Ultimately, this phase set the stage for the dramatic unraveling of Dahmer's criminal enterprise. The convergence of investigative diligence, community vigilance, and systemic pressure created conditions in which long-concealed patterns could be recognized and acted upon. While Dahmer's sophistication, social camouflage, and ritualized methods had prolonged his predation for years, the increasing convergence of these forces would soon make detection unavoidable, leading to one of the most infamous serial crime investigations in modern history. Chapter 12: The Arrest. The day the mask fell, the day Jeffrey Dahmer's carefully constructed life of secrecy and ritualized violence came to an abrupt end, remains one of the most chilling moments in criminal history. Until that point, he had successfully maintained a dual existence: an unremarkable, polite neighbor in the community, and a meticulous, methodical predator operating in the shadows. The arrest, precipitated by a single incident of unexpected intervention, serves as a stark reminder of how even the most organized offenders can be undone by unforeseen variables and the vigilance of ordinary individuals. On the day that would ultimately expose Dahmer's crimes, the sequence of events began innocuously but escalated rapidly due to a combination of victim agency and police responsiveness. A potential victim, responding with courage and presence of mind, managed to escape an encounter that had been intended to follow Dahmer's ritualized pattern of control and submission. This escape disrupted the predictable operational flow Dahmer relied upon, illustrating a critical vulnerability inherent even in the most meticulously planned predatory behaviors. The escapee's immediate actions were pivotal. Fleeing from Dahmer's apartment and seeking assistance from law enforcement, he provided first-hand testimony that challenged assumptions about safety in the community and offered tangible evidence of potential criminal activity. This intervention underscores the crucial role that victim awareness and proactive response can play in halting prolonged cycles of predation. It also highlights the thin margins separating continued concealment from exposure for organized offenders. Law enforcement's response to the escapee's report was methodical and urgent. Officers, trained to assess risk and evaluate the credibility of eyewitness accounts, proceeded to Dahmer's residence with caution but determination. The context of prior missing persons reports and community concerns heightened the investigative urgency, transforming what might have been considered an isolated incident into a critical point of potential revelation. This response exemplifies the convergence of procedural diligence, situational awareness, and investigative training in achieving the apprehension of a highly organized offender. Upon arrival, law enforcement encountered the immediate complexity of Dahmer's dual identity. The apartment, outwardly nondescript, concealed a grim reality that would shock investigators and the public alike. Inside, evidence of ritualized predatory behavior was both extensive and meticulously organized, reflecting the culmination of years of compulsion, experimentation, and methodical execution. The contrast between external normalcy and internal pathology became starkly visible, underscoring the extraordinary capacity for compartmentalization and deception. The discovery of physical evidence in Dahmer's residence provided unprecedented insight into the scope and nature of his crimes. Materials used in sedation, restraint, and preservation, alongside documentation of ritualized sequences, offered a comprehensive view of both method and motivation. Investigators were confronted with the tangible manifestation of behaviors that had previously existed only as missing persons reports, anecdotal suspicion, and unconnected patterns. This evidence bridged the gap between psychological compulsion and observable criminal activity, solidifying the case against him. Dahmer's arrest was characterized by a mixture of immediate recognition and strategic immobilization. Confronted with overwhelming evidence and the collapse of his operational concealment, He had limited capacity to negotiate or manipulate the situation. The arrest exemplifies the dynamic wherein even highly adaptive offenders can be rendered powerless when operational control is suddenly disrupted by intervention and systematic response. It also highlights the critical interplay between victim action, investigative diligence, and procedural execution in bringing predation to an end. Media and public response to the arrest amplified the shock of the revelation. News of Dahmer's dual life, the extent of his crimes, and the meticulous nature of his operations quickly captured national attention. The psychological and sociological dimensions of the case were widely analyzed, including questions about the effectiveness of community vigilance, systemic gaps, and the extraordinary capacity for compartmentalized deviance. The arrest became a focal point not only for criminal justice outcomes but also for societal reflection on the hidden potential for organized predation in seemingly ordinary settings. Importantly, the arrest provided an opportunity to understand the psychological architecture of Dahmer's compulsions. Law enforcement, forensic specialists, and later psychologists examined the behavioral, cognitive, and ritualized elements revealed by the physical evidence. The interplay of control, ritual, mental rehearsal, and compulsive gratification offered unprecedented insight into how organized serial offenders integrate fantasy, planning, and execution, and how external disruption, such as an escapee, can trigger the collapse of even the most methodical operational systems. The immediate aftermath of the arrest involved securing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and documenting the extensive materials within Dahmer's apartment. Investigators faced the challenge of interpreting complex ritualistic patterns, chemical substances, and the remains of past predation while simultaneously preserving the integrity of the legal process. This stage was critical in transforming a single incident of intervention into a comprehensive case capable of withstanding judicial scrutiny, ultimately ensuring that Dahmer's extended cycle of predation would be legally addressed. By the conclusion of this initial arrest phase, it became clear that the convergence of victim courage, investigative diligence, and procedural rigor had pierced the veil of Dahmer's carefully maintained dual existence. The arrest represented not only the cessation of immediate predation, but also the opening of a broader investigation that would reveal the full scope of ritualized crime, psychological complexity, and operational sophistication that had remained hidden for years. It stands as a defining moment in criminal history, illustrating how meticulous offenders, despite years of careful concealment, can be undone by a combination of vigilance, chance, and procedural acumen. Following the arrest of Jeffrey Dahmer, investigators were confronted with the overwhelming scope and methodical nature of his crimes. The initial shock of discovery quickly transformed into meticulous documentation, forensic analysis, and a systematic effort to reconstruct years of predatory behavior. Each piece of evidence, from preserved remains to chemical paraphernalia, illuminated the deliberate planning, ritualized execution, and obsessive compulsion that had defined his criminal career. The arrest, which began as the intervention of a courageous escapee, had now opened a door to understanding the full magnitude of Dahmer's organized predation. Inside Dahmer's apartment, law enforcement discovered a calculated environment engineered to facilitate control, concealment, and ritualized gratification. Chemical substances used for sedation, tools for restraint, and evidence of post-mortem experimentation reflected the depth of preparation and the repetitive refinement of methods. This operational environment was not chaotic but meticulously structured, reinforcing the understanding that Dahmer's crimes were neither impulsive nor opportunistic but highly organized. The apartment itself became a lens into the interplay between compulsion, ritual, and practical execution. Physical evidence revealed the psychological dimensions of Dahmer's behavior. The arrangement of remains, preservation attempts, and methodical manipulation of victims underscored his obsession with control and permanence. Each act of preparation, from chemical experimentation to precise positioning, reflected a fusion of fantasy and execution, a hallmark of highly organized offenders. Investigators noted that the rituals served multiple purposes: satisfying compulsive desires, reinforcing a sense of mastery, and providing tangible feedback on operational success. Interviews with the escapee and surviving witnesses offered additional context. Their accounts provided direct testimony of Dahmer's manipulative interactions, his methods of isolating victims, and the psychological tactics employed to gain compliance. These narratives, combined with forensic findings, allowed investigators to reconstruct the operational flow of his crimes, from initial engagement to post-mortem rituals. The integration of human observation and tangible evidence exemplifies the comprehensive approach required to understand complex predatory behavior. The arrest also prompted broader scrutiny of systemic gaps and societal assumptions that had enabled prolonged predation. Law enforcement, social services, and community stakeholders began examining how missing persons reports, fragmented communication, and social invisibility contributed to the delayed detection of Dahmer's activities. The case highlighted the critical importance of coordination, vigilance, and responsiveness in mitigating the risk posed by organized offenders. It also emphasized that even highly sophisticated individuals can be exposed when ordinary structures, victim action, community awareness, and procedural diligence intersect effectively. Psychologically, the arrest disrupted the feedback loops that had sustained Dahmer's compulsions. The sudden loss of operational control, exposure of private rituals, and confrontation with legal authority forced a temporary suspension of compulsive behavior. While his internal motivations and obsessions persisted, the external circumstances imposed immediate limitations, illustrating the role of environmental constraints in moderating pathological behavior. The arrest became both a physical and psychological turning point, severing the link between fantasy-driven compulsion and real-world execution. As the investigation progressed, authorities began compiling evidence to pursue legal action. Documentation of ritualistic sequences, chemical use, and behavioral patterns provided a robust framework for prosecution. Forensic psychologists and criminal profilers contributed insights into Dahmer's psychological architecture, linking observed behavior to underlying compulsions, fantasies, and organizational strategies. This multidimensional approach not only strengthened the legal case but also enhanced the broader understanding of how highly organized serial offenders operate over extended periods. The arrest had significant social and cultural ramifications. Media coverage, public fascination, and societal reflection intensified as details emerged, illustrating the dual nature of Dahmer's existence. Outwardly ordinary, internally pathological. The case became a lens through which communities examined both the vulnerability of marginalized populations and the limitations of social and institutional awareness. The arrest, therefore, was not merely a cessation of immediate criminal activity, but a catalyst for broader discussion on prevention, detection, and the societal factors that can obscure extreme deviance in the immediate aftermath. Authorities faced the task of managing the extensive evidence while safeguarding ongoing investigation and prosecution. Each item recovered, whether chemical, physical, or documentary, had to be meticulously cataloged, analyzed, and contextualized within the broader pattern of criminal behavior. The scale of the operation revealed the depth of Dahmer's planning and the consistency of his compulsive rituals, providing unprecedented insight into the operational mechanics of prolonged predation. Ultimately, the arrest marked the collapse of a carefully maintained dual existence. Years of ritualized predation, meticulous concealment, and psychological compartmentalization were abruptly exposed, demonstrating the vulnerability of even the most organized offenders to unforeseen variables and persistent investigative pressure. The combination of victim courage, procedural diligence, and systematic analysis ensured that Dahmer's crimes could no longer remain hidden, transitioning the narrative from prolonged invisibility to public, legal, and psychological reckoning. Chapter 13: Trial and Public Reaction. The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer represents a pivotal chapter in the intersection of criminal justice, public fascination, and psychological analysis. Following his arrest, the shocking scope and meticulous nature of his crimes had become a matter of national attention, and the courtroom became the arena in which the duality of his existence, quiet neighbor versus ritualized predator, would be laid bare. The proceedings not only sought to determine legal accountability but also to interpret and communicate the extraordinary psychological and social dimensions of one of the most notorious serial offenders in modern history. From the outset, the trial was unprecedented in both its scale and its intensity. The courtroom had to accommodate an array of participants: prosecution and defense teams, forensic psychologists, law enforcement officials, surviving witnesses, and families of victims. The atmosphere was tense, reflecting both the gravity of the charges and the public anticipation surrounding the case. Media coverage amplified the sensation, with news reports capturing both the meticulous details of the crimes and the broader implications for societal understanding of serial predation. Central to the trial was the presentation of evidence, which included photographs, forensic materials, and documentation of ritualized activities within Dahmer's residence. Each piece of evidence illustrated the organized, methodical nature of the crimes and the integration of compulsion, fantasy, and execution. Forensic experts described the substances used for sedation, the post-mortem manipulations, and the preservation techniques, providing the jury with a detailed framework for understanding the extent of Dahmer's predatory behaviors. The evidence was not merely illustrative. It was foundational to establishing both the scope and premeditated nature of his actions. Psychological testimony played a critical role in framing the case. Forensic psychologists and criminal profilers provided insight into Dahmer's mental state, highlighting the interplay between compulsion, fantasy, and cognitive sophistication. Their analyses explained how he maintained social normalcy while engaging in prolonged predation, and how ritualized behaviors served both gratification and operational efficiency. These insights were essential in helping the court and the public comprehend the underlying mechanisms that allowed a quiet neighbor to commit crimes of extreme cruelty over an extended period. The defense strategy focused on questions of mental competence and criminal responsibility. Dahmer's psychological profile, while complex, was scrutinized for indications of diminished capacity or the presence of mental disorders that could mitigate culpability. Experts debated the degree to which compulsive fantasies and obsessive behaviors influenced conscious decision-making. These deliberations illuminated the nuanced relationship between pathology and legal accountability, underscoring the challenges inherent in prosecuting highly organized offenders whose internal compulsions are in tension with observable rationality. Public reaction to the trial was intense and multifaceted. Communities, both local and national, grappled with the stark contrast between Dahmer's outward ordinariness and the extreme nature of his crimes. There was shock and horror at the methodical execution and ritualized behavior revealed during proceedings, combined with a societal fascination with understanding the psychological and environmental factors that enabled prolonged predation. Media narratives emphasized both the human tragedy of the victims and the terrifying duality of Dahmer's existence, shaping public discourse on crime, detection, and psychological deviance. Victim impact statements became a powerful aspect of the trial, giving voice to the families affected by Dahmer's actions. These statements humanized the abstract details of forensic evidence, emphasizing the emotional, social, and psychological toll on individuals and communities. By integrating personal narratives into the courtroom proceedings, the trial underscored the broader societal consequences of predatory behavior and highlighted the importance of systemic responsiveness and community vigilance in preventing similar tragedies. The trial also prompted scrutiny of systemic failures. Questions arose about how social invisibility, institutional gaps, and fragmented reporting had allowed Dahmer to operate undetected for years. The proceedings stimulated reflection on law enforcement practices, community awareness, and the vulnerabilities that can be exploited by organized offenders. The courtroom became a forum not only for adjudication but also for examining the broader social context that had enabled prolonged predation. Legal procedures were meticulously followed to balance the rights of the accused with the need for comprehensive documentation of evidence and testimony. Each stage of the trial, from presentation of evidence to cross-examination of experts, highlighted the complexities of prosecuting a highly organized serial offender. The judicial process required careful navigation of legal standards, psychological analysis, and public scrutiny, illustrating the multifaceted nature of adjudicating crimes of extraordinary depravity. Ultimately, the trial of Jeffrey Dahmer was more than a legal proceeding. It was a cultural and psychological examination of the extremes of human behavior. It juxtaposed the banality of his social existence against the extraordinary cruelty of his private actions, forcing both the court and the public to confront uncomfortable truths about the capacity for hidden deviance, the vulnerabilities of social and institutional structures, and the mechanisms that can facilitate prolonged criminal activity. The courtroom served as the stage on which the full narrative of Dahmer's dual life, quiet neighbor and ritualized predator, was made undeniable, exposing the chilling realities that had remained invisible for so long. As the trial of Jeffrey Dahmer progressed, public attention intensified, and the proceedings became a lens through which society grappled with the unsettling intersection of psychological pathology, social vulnerability, and institutional oversight. Each day in court offered a stark juxtaposition between the ordinary, quiet image of Dahmer and the extreme, meticulously organized nature of his predatory acts. The second phase of the trial not only focused on legal adjudication but also illuminated broader societal questions about detection, accountability, and human behavior. One of the most striking elements of the trial was the detailed testimony provided by forensic and psychological experts. Witnesses described the cognitive and behavioral mechanisms that had enabled Dahmer to maintain social normalcy while simultaneously engaging in prolonged predation. These insights emphasized the role of mental rehearsal, ritualization, and compulsive fantasy in shaping his actions. By elucidating the link between internal compulsion and observable criminal behavior, experts provided the jury and the public with a framework for understanding how such extreme deviance could persist undetected in a familiar community. The prosecution meticulously reconstructed the chronology of Dahmer's offenses. Using evidence from his apartment, forensic materials, and witness accounts, they demonstrated the systematic nature of his crimes. Each stage of his predatory process, from initial engagement and isolation of victims to the execution of ritualized postmortem practices, was outlined with precision. The methodical presentation underscored the premeditated character of his actions, countering any suggestion that they were impulsive or circumstantial. The courtroom became a space where meticulous documentation met the emotional weight of human loss, conveying both procedural clarity and moral gravity. Victims' families played a central role in humanizing the abstract details of forensic analysis. Impact statements highlighted the emotional devastation, grief, and lasting trauma inflicted upon the community. These personal narratives reinforced the societal stakes of the trial, reminding jurors and observers that the case extended far beyond the technical aspects of criminal procedure. The combination of scientific testimony and human testimony created a comprehensive understanding of the profound consequences of Dahmer's actions, both legally and socially. Public reaction to the trial was complex and multifaceted. Media coverage amplified societal shock, fascination, and horror. News reports, documentaries, and analyses dissected the duality of Dahmer's life, often emphasizing the unnerving contrast between his outward ordinariness and his private pathology. The case prompted widespread reflection on the mechanisms of concealment, the vulnerabilities of marginalized populations, and the role of community and institutional oversight in detecting extreme deviance. The trial became a cultural moment, shaping collective understanding of serial predation and the psychology of organized offenders. Debates around mental health and criminal responsibility emerged as a central theme. Experts discussed the extent to which Dahmer's compulsions and psychological abnormalities influenced his decision-making, while the defense explored potential mitigating factors related to mental disorder. These discussions highlighted the tension between recognizing internal pathology and establishing accountability for deliberate, premeditated actions. The nuanced exploration of these themes contributed to broader societal understanding of the intersection between psychology, law, and moral responsibility. The trial also prompted scrutiny of law enforcement practices. Questions about missed opportunities, systemic gaps, and delayed intervention became focal points of discussion. Analysts and the public alike examined how fragmented reporting, social invisibility of victims, and procedural shortcomings allowed Dahmer to operate for years. The proceedings underscored the importance of coordinated investigative practices, community engagement, and procedural diligence in preventing prolonged predation, highlighting lessons with implications far beyond the specifics of the case. As the trial neared conclusion, attention turned to sentencing, moral accountability, and the societal imperative to prevent future crimes. The evidence, psychological analysis, and victim testimony coalesced into a comprehensive portrayal of Dahmer as a highly organized, compulsive offender whose actions had devastating consequences. The courtroom effectively conveyed both the factual and moral dimensions of the case, leaving an indelible impression on jurors, the public, and the broader field of criminal justice. Ultimately, the trial of Jeffrey Dahmer was more than a legal proceeding. It became a societal reflection on human vulnerability, institutional responsibility, and the complexities of hidden deviance. It juxtaposed the ordinariness of everyday life against the extraordinary cruelty of concealed pathology, forcing observers to confront uncomfortable truths about both human nature and social structures. By the conclusion of the trial, the full scope of Dahmer's crimes, the mechanisms that had allowed them to persist, and the human consequences of his actions had been made undeniably clear, providing lessons for both criminal justice and societal awareness. Chapter 14: Incarceration. Life behind bars. Following his conviction, Jeffrey Dahmer's transition from a meticulously concealed predator to an incarcerated individual presented a stark contrast between the autonomy he once wielded and the structured limitations imposed by prison life. His entry into the correctional system marked the beginning of a new chapter, not only for Dahmer himself but also for law enforcement, psychologists, and the public seeking to understand the psychological and social dimensions of a serial offender deprived of operational freedom. Life behind bars forced Dahmer into an environment where his compulsive behaviors, social manipulation, and meticulous planning could no longer be exercised in the physical sense. Yet the psychological underpinnings of his pathology continued to play a defining role in his daily existence. Dahmer's initial adjustment to incarceration was marked by tension and observation. Prison staff were acutely aware of the high-profile nature of his crimes and the potential risks associated with housing an offender whose notoriety made him a target. From the outset, he was monitored closely, and behavioral assessments were conducted to anticipate how he might interact with both inmates and correctional personnel. These observations offered a controlled environment to study his social adaptability, response to confinement, and the management of compulsive urges when external execution was no longer possible. Incarceration introduced a structured routine that contrasted sharply with the flexible operational freedom Dahmer had previously maintained. Meals, work assignments, recreation, and interaction with other inmates were regulated, limiting opportunities for manipulative behavior or unsupervised activity. Despite these constraints, Dahmer demonstrated a degree of adaptability, participating in religious services, engaging in reading, and attempting to maintain a semblance of normalcy within the prison system. These behaviors can be interpreted as either genuine attempts at rehabilitation, strategic self-presentation, or a combination of both, a complex interplay reflecting his history of compartmentalization and social manipulation. The psychological dimension of incarceration was particularly significant. Dahmer's compulsions, once expressed through physical acts, were now confined to mental rehearsal, reflection, and adaptation. Without the ability to execute his previous behaviors, his internal cycles of fantasy, control, and ritual were challenged. Prison provided an environment in which the psychological architecture of his pathology could be observed indirectly through communication, behavior, and adaptation to routine. The structured environment simultaneously constrained and illuminated aspects of compulsive behavior, highlighting how deeply ingrained patterns can persist even when external execution is impossible. Interactions with other inmates were limited and complex. Dahmer's notoriety preceded him, eliciting reactions ranging from fear to hostility. Maintaining personal safety became a critical aspect of his daily routine, requiring constant situational awareness and adaptive social strategies. He relied on a combination of compliance, strategic disengagement, and low-profile behavior to navigate a volatile social environment. These adaptations illustrate the ongoing role of cognitive flexibility and situational analysis in organized offenders. Even under strict institutional control, Dahmer's engagement with religious and therapeutic programs also drew attention. He participated in religious services, studied scripture, and engaged with available counseling resources. While some interpreted these behaviors as genuine attempts at understanding and transformation, others viewed them as strategic efforts to cultivate a positive public image or mitigate potential threats within the prison population. Regardless of motivation, these activities provided insight into the ways in which highly organized offenders manage social perception, internal compulsions, and environmental constraints in controlled settings. Prison life also exposed Dahmer to persistent social isolation, an experience that contrasted with his previous manipulation of private environments to achieve control. In the absence of free movement, opportunity, and unsupervised interaction, he faced a form of containment that limited both physical and psychological expression. The enforced separation from potential targets, coupled with constant monitoring, created a new form of psychological pressure, illustrating how environmental constraints can influence the expression of pathological behaviors. The structured environment of incarceration forced Dahmer into reflection on the consequences of his actions. Through interactions with prison staff, participation in programs, and personal contemplation, he confronted the tangible reality of accountability, loss of autonomy, and public notoriety. This reflection, whether genuine or performative, added a new layer to the understanding of how organized offenders respond to systemic containment, social exposure, and enforced limitation of compulsive behavior. In essence, Dahmer's incarceration provides a case study in the adaptation of highly organized offenders to environments that remove the operational freedom previously essential to their compulsions. The interplay between internal pathology, external constraints, and social perception within the prison system offers a unique lens through which to examine both behavioral continuity and transformation. Life behind bars did not erase Dahmer's compulsions or pathological fantasies, but it imposed a framework in which expression was curtailed, observation was constant, and social consequences were immediate and unavoidable. As Jeffrey Dahmer settled into the structured confines of prison life, the interplay between his compulsions, social behavior, and the rigid institutional framework became increasingly apparent. Deprived of the freedom to execute predatory behaviors, he relied on internal processes, reflection, mental rehearsal, and adaptive social strategies to navigate the constraints of incarceration. These adaptations highlight the enduring psychological architecture of a highly organized serial offender when faced with prolonged environmental restriction and constant surveillance. Daily life within the correctional system demanded vigilance and awareness. Dahmer's notoriety ensured that he was both a subject of scrutiny and a potential target among fellow inmates. Survival depended on maintaining a low profile, avoiding confrontation, and strategically engaging with others. This environment required him to continuously assess social dynamics, interpret risk, and adjust behavior, skills that had been honed during his years of concealed predation, now repurposed to navigate the rigid hierarchy and volatility of prison society. The necessity for adaptation underscores the cognitive flexibility inherent in organized offenders, whose social intelligence extends beyond predation into environmental navigation. Religious engagement became a central component of Dahmer's prison experience. He attended services, engaged with religious mentors, and explored the moral dimensions of his actions through spiritual reflection. For some observers, this appeared as a genuine attempt at remorse or transformation. For others, it was viewed as a strategic performance to manage both inmate perception and institutional evaluation. Regardless of intent, these activities provided critical insight into how offenders employ structured frameworks, such as religion or therapy, to manage internal compulsions, social positioning, and public perception within constrained environments. Interaction with correctional staff also revealed elements of Dahmer's psychological adaptation. He demonstrated compliance, cooperation, and outward conformity to rules, which facilitated both operational safety and personal stability. These behaviors exemplify the compartmentalization observed throughout his life, now applied to institutional living, separating private compulsive impulses from socially regulated conduct to maintain equilibrium and reduce external threat. This duality reflects a hallmark of organized offenders, the capacity to present controlled behavior in public while privately maintaining complex internal patterns. Despite environmental restrictions, Dahmer's internal compulsions persisted. Psychological assessment and interviews indicated ongoing preoccupation with ritualized fantasy, control, and reflection on prior offenses. Incarceration constrained physical expression but did not eliminate the mental and emotional reinforcement cycles established over years of predatory behavior. This distinction highlights the resilience of compulsive pathology, particularly in highly organized individuals, and the challenge of addressing such deep-seated behavioral patterns within institutional settings. Social isolation within the prison environment imposed additional psychological pressures. Unlike his private apartments, where he could meticulously manipulate surroundings and people, incarceration forced reliance on the structured environment and limited peer interaction. The removal of physical agency over others required adjustment, and Dahmer's strategies shifted toward negotiation, compliance, and mental rehearsal. These adaptations reveal the interplay between compulsive desire and environmental limitation, illustrating how organized offenders can maintain cognitive continuity of behavior even when external execution is blocked. Therapeutic and counseling programs offered avenues for behavioral reflection and potential rehabilitation. Dahmer participated selectively, discussing moral, psychological, and spiritual considerations, though the authenticity of his engagement remained a topic of debate. These interactions provided insight into the ways offenders process accountability, confront internal pathology, and attempt to negotiate personal identity within a highly regulated environment. The prison context transformed the psychological dynamics of compulsive behavior, offering both constraint and opportunity for observation and intervention. The broader societal implications of Dahmer's incarceration were significant. His presence in the prison system provoked discussion on the management of high-profile offenders, the role of rehabilitation versus containment, and the psychological consequences of long-term incarceration for individuals with deeply ingrained compulsive behaviors. Additionally, his case became a point of reference for law enforcement, psychologists, and the public in understanding how highly organized offenders adapt to environments that limit operational freedom while maintaining internal compulsions. Ultimately, Dahmer's life behind bars represents a microcosm of the tension between pathology and constraint. The structures of incarceration curtailed the ability to act on compulsions, imposed constant observation, and necessitated social adaptation, yet could not fully eradicate the internal architecture of desire, ritual, and cognitive reinforcement. Studying his adaptation within prison illuminates both the resilience of organized criminal pathology and the role of systemic containment in mitigating further harm, providing a rare lens into the ongoing life of a serial offender once removed from direct access to victims. Chapter 15: Legacy and Lessons. Society, Psychology, and Prevention. The case of Jeffrey Dahmer continues to resonate far beyond the walls of Milwaukee or the prison system, serving as a chilling reminder of the potential for hidden deviance, the limits of social perception, and the critical importance of coordinated systemic intervention. His crimes, once concealed under the facade of normalcy, became a lens through which society could examine psychological pathology, institutional vulnerabilities, and community responsibility. The legacy of Dahmer's predation is multifaceted, encompassing legal, social, and psychological dimensions, and offers invaluable lessons for both understanding human behavior and improving detection and prevention of organized crime. From a psychological perspective, Dahmer's case illuminates the interplay between compulsion, fantasy, and methodical execution in organized serial offenders. His behaviors exemplify the persistence of deeply ingrained pathological patterns even in the face of environmental constraints, as demonstrated by his adaptation to incarceration. Studying his compulsions, ritualized behaviors, and compartmentalization provides insight into how mental rehearsal and cognitive obsession can drive prolonged predatory activity. These lessons have informed criminal profiling, risk assessment, and forensic psychology, offering frameworks to anticipate, identify, and intervene in cases involving organized offenders with similar psychological architecture. Dahmer's crimes also highlight the social vulnerabilities exploited by serial predators. Many of his victims belong to marginalized populations, transient individuals, socially isolated men, or those whose disappearances attracted less immediate attention. This pattern underscores the critical need for robust community engagement, vigilant reporting systems, and institutional responsiveness. The societal failure to promptly detect patterns in missing persons reports, combined with fragmented communication between agencies, illustrates how systemic gaps can be exploited by organized offenders. Recognizing and addressing these vulnerabilities remains an essential aspect of prevention and public safety initiatives. The legal and law enforcement responses to Dahmer's crimes demonstrate the evolution of investigative strategies. The eventual identification and arrest of Dahmer were the results of cumulative investigative effort, community intervention, and procedural diligence. Pattern recognition, cross-referencing of missing persons reports, and the integration of witness testimony exemplify how systematic methodology can overcome even highly organized predation. His case has influenced law enforcement protocols, emphasizing the importance of coordinated data collection, interagency communication, and the critical role of public awareness in facilitating detection. Media coverage and public fascination with Dahmer's dual life, ordinary neighbor versus ritualized predator, contributed to broader societal reflection. Documentaries, news reports, and academic analyses dissected both the operational mechanics of his crimes and the psychological underpinnings that enabled them. While this attention sometimes risked sensationalism, it also fostered dialogue about human behavior, institutional responsibility, and the mechanisms through which hidden deviance can persist. The public response underscores the intersection between cultural fascination, psychological inquiry, and social vigilance in shaping collective understanding of crime. Dahmer's case has had lasting influence on corrections and rehabilitation approaches. Incarceration, while limiting his ability to commit further predation, exposed the challenges of managing individuals with persistent compulsions and high-profile notoriety. His engagement with religious, therapeutic, and educational programs provided insight into the potential and limits of behavioral adaptation in controlled environments. The lessons drawn from his adaptation inform strategies for containment, monitoring, and rehabilitation of high-risk offenders, highlighting the balance between safety, observation, and potential cognitive or moral intervention. Education and awareness campaigns have also emerged from Dahmer's legacy. Understanding the signs of predatory behavior, the importance of documenting disappearances, and the need for vigilance in both social and institutional contexts has become a cornerstone of preventive strategies. Training for law enforcement, social workers, and communities now increasingly incorporates case studies like Dahmer's to illustrate the interplay between opportunity, psychological pathology, and systemic vulnerability. These educational efforts reinforce the principle that early recognition, coordinated response, and social engagement are critical in preventing prolonged predation. Moreover, Dahmer's crimes continue to serve as a cautionary tale in the psychological and criminological literature. His behaviors illustrate the capacity for hidden deviance to persist under the guise of normalcy, emphasizing the need for comprehensive approaches to risk assessment, offender profiling, and preventive intervention. The combination of compulsion, ritualization, and operational sophistication underscores the challenges of detection and the necessity of vigilance across social, institutional, and psychological domains. By examining the enduring impact of Dahmer's actions, society gains not only insight into the nature of extreme criminal pathology, but also the lessons necessary to mitigate similar risks in the future. His legacy is a somber reminder that even in environments where social interactions appear ordinary, the potential for organized predation exists, necessitating ongoing vigilance, systemic coordination, and the integration of psychological, legal, and social strategies. Understanding, documenting, and learning from such cases are essential to both justice and prevention, ensuring that society is better equipped to recognize and respond to hidden threats. The final phase of Jeffrey Dahmer's story emphasizes reflection on societal, psychological, and preventive dimensions, drawing lessons that extend far beyond the individual case. His life and crimes provide an enduring framework for understanding the convergence of personal pathology, social vulnerability, and systemic oversight. While Dahmer's actions were extraordinary in their cruelty and scope, they also reveal patterns, vulnerabilities, and preventive measures that remain highly relevant in contemporary criminology, law enforcement, and public awareness. A central aspect of Dahmer's legacy lies in the integration of forensic psychology into both investigative and preventive strategies. His case illustrates how methodical analysis of behavior, ritualized patterns, and psychological compulsion can be used to anticipate offender behavior. Forensic profilers now routinely study patterns exemplified by Dahmer, selection of socially marginalized victims, controlled environments, and ritualized post-offense behaviors to develop predictive frameworks. These frameworks not only aid law enforcement in identifying and apprehending organized offenders, but also help social services assess risk factors, design intervention strategies, and prioritize protective measures for vulnerable populations. Dahmer's crimes have also reshaped public understanding of serial predation. The stark contrast between his outwardly ordinary life and private predatory behavior challenges assumptions about appearance, normalcy, and risk. Communities now better recognize that dangerous behaviors are not always obvious, and that social invisibility can be exploited by organized offenders. Educational campaigns, media literacy, and community training programs draw on cases like Dahmer's to highlight the importance of vigilance, reporting anomalies, and understanding the subtle signs of predatory behavior. His story underscores the principle that early awareness and proactive social engagement can prevent prolonged cycles of victimization. From a legal and investigative standpoint, Dahmer's case prompted significant reflection on procedural gaps. Fragmented reporting of missing persons, insufficient interagency communication, and initial misinterpretation of patterns allowed him to operate undetected for years. These gaps have since been addressed through improved database systems, coordinated task forces, and enhanced training for law enforcement personnel. His case serves as a benchmark for evaluating investigative efficacy, emphasizing that systematic review, community collaboration, and pattern recognition are crucial in detecting organized predatory behavior. Psychologically, Dahmer's post-arrest and incarceration behaviors continue to be studied for insights into compulsive pathology. His adaptation to prison, engagement with religious programs, and selective participation in counseling illustrate how organized offenders respond to environmental constraints. These observations inform both correctional strategies and rehabilitation research, highlighting the distinction between external containment and internal compulsive processes. Understanding this interplay assists in designing interventions that account for persistent psychological patterns while ensuring institutional safety. The societal response to Dahmer has also included reflection on ethical, cultural, and moral dimensions. Public fascination with his dual life, the polite neighbor juxtaposed with a ritualized predator, has sparked discussion on human morality, the limits of social perception, and the ethical responsibilities of institutions and communities. His case forces society to grapple with uncomfortable questions. How can communities better protect marginalized individuals? How should institutions balance vigilance with civil liberties? How do we detect and respond to hidden deviance before it escalates to catastrophic harm? These reflections underscore the broader impact of Dahmer's actions on societal awareness and policy. Preventive strategies derived from Dahmer's legacy now emphasize a multi-layered approach. This includes enhanced community engagement, robust missing persons protocols, interagency data sharing, and psychological profiling. Law enforcement and social services increasingly integrate case studies like Dahmer's into training programs, using them to illustrate both warning signs and the consequences of delayed detection. The lessons drawn are not only reactive but proactive, aiming to prevent similar predatory behavior by improving societal infrastructure, awareness, and responsiveness. Dahmer's story also underscores the critical role of courage and intervention by potential victims. The escape that ultimately led to his arrest illustrates that individual awareness and action can disrupt even the most meticulously planned predation. This principle continues to inform public safety campaigns, emphasizing empowerment, vigilance, and the importance of immediate reporting to authorities when suspicious activity is observed. It reinforces the idea that prevention is both systemic and personal, requiring coordination across institutions and active participation by individuals. In conclusion, the legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer is a somber yet profoundly instructive one. It demonstrates the intersection of individual pathology, social vulnerability, and institutional gaps, offering lessons in psychology, criminal justice, and societal responsibility. While his crimes were horrific, their enduring relevance lies in the insights they provide into the mechanisms of organized predation, the importance of early detection, and the strategies necessary to prevent future harm. By studying and reflecting on his actions, society gains tools not only for understanding extreme human behavior, but also for safeguarding vulnerable populations and improving systemic vigilance.